Greetings, citizens of the world.
This is Virtual Verity.
We are anonymous.
It has cameras and sensors.
It's a podcast.
Because again, this is the day of launch. 3 a.m. it starts crashing, and at 6 a.m. Bukele is on Twitter doing customer support.
Aprendamos a usar Chivo Wallet.
El Salvador's state-owned Bitcoin wallet, Chivo, has suffered a severe cybersecurity breach, compromising its source code and VPN credentials.
The US has been quite vocal about democratic erosion in El Salvador. 30-day state of emergency has been extended continuously for 2 years.
I'm Mark Bruno, a cybersecurity and conflict analyst. This is Virtual Verity, where I discuss topics at the nexus of technology, infosec, open source intelligence, and modern conflict. When we think of dystopian fiction, we're presented with societies on the brink of collapse, with the traditional markers of a healthy liberal democracy hollowed out, freedom of the press and speech, assumption of privacy, your right to a trial. Almost every cyberpunk or apocalyptic sci-fi story depicts such a future as high-tech and low-life, with a world that seems vaguely around the corner. Yes, there can be attractive trappings of semi-futuristic technologies, heavy automation that doesn't seem to actually make life better, cybernetic enhancements that always seem just janky enough that no sane person would trust them, no matter how cool they look, everything being networked with no data out of reach, and devices that have no business being networked or automated ending up online. Despite the amount of shiny trinkets everyone partakes in these scenarios, this technology always seems, in the end, to benefit those at the top of their society the most, those who extract and grift their way to power and comfort. For the working class characters in these worlds, their need to implement and accept these changes are at the peril of starvation, or with other financial or economic motivations. It's integral to the genre. And this world always seems to come with the price of mass surveillance, environmental degradation, militarized police forces, a horrifically carceral justice system, eroded support for those in society who need it the most. The premise of this podcast, and most of my other writing, fiction or otherwise, is this idea that the cyberpunk future is already here. Chicken Little stuff. I try to keep everything self-deprecating and kitsch enough for my own sanity. In El Salvador, we're witnessing the eerie parallels to this dystopian narrative. The country's embraced Bitcoin as legal tender, a move that, while innovative, has sparked significant controversy and division. This digital currency shift was intended to modernize the economy and attract investment, but it's also introduced a new layer of complexity and vulnerability to an already fragile system. Enter the Chivo Wallet, El Salvador's state-sponsored digital wallet designed to facilitate Bitcoin transactions. Touted as a step towards financial inclusion, it has instead become a symbol of the precariousness and volatility that comes with rapid technological adoption, with no thought of the consequences. Reports of hacks and security breaches have emerged, raising alarms about the safety and reliability of this new financial infrastructure. After a disastrous launch and months of issues, Chivo Wallet was broadly considered a failed experiment, yet the infrastructure remains, and it remains vulnerable. In April of this year, a cyber threat actor noticed Cyberintelligentsia SV dropped several data leaks that revealed just how weak and vulnerable Salvadoran society's data had become due to this ill-conceived plan that, from many perspectives, seems more like a grift than anything. Over 5 million Salvadoran social security numbers, addresses, and photo IDs were leaked, as well as the source code of the Chivo Wallet software itself. As we dig into the specifics of the Chivo Wallet hack, it's crucial to understand the broader context. El Salvador faces economic instability, with high levels of debt and reliance on remittances from other countries. The government's pivot to cryptocurrency can be seen as a desperate gamble, one that mirrors the high-tech, low-life dichotomy of cyberpunk fiction. The promise of cutting-edge technology juxtaposed with the harsh reality of economic desperation and social unrest. In this episode, we'll explore the implications of the Chivo Wallet hack, the vulnerabilities it exposed, and what it might say about the autocratic trajectory of the Bukele administration, and perhaps a trend in the so-called global south. How does this real-world scenario reflect the cyberpunk ethos? And what lessons can we learn about the intersection of technology, power, and society? In this very special episode, I'll need some help since I'm attempting to dig into this story with far more socioeconomic context than I normally need to adequately explain a cybersecurity or cyber warfare incident. I'll be speaking briefly with two colleagues of mine, Alessia and Rose, and using a bunch of resources that they pointed me in the direction of. Alessia is a security professional whose studies have largely driven her to a pedigree in human rights and conflict, largely in Central and Latin America.
Right. I've been a security analyst, intelligence security analyst for a private firm for 4 years now. And before that, I've done some research on Latin America, specifically Central America, but also Colombia. I studied conflict studies, and I just really interested in the dynamics of the region. I got very interested in more of the human rights side of things. I took a minor in a university in Colombia from basically human rights and transitional justice, and it was I was there for 6 months, which was really interesting. And then afterwards, I did my master's in conflict studies and human rights.
Rose, keeping his story a little closer to the chest, is, we'll say, well-versed in scam economics and organized crime, particularly around topics involving cryptocurrency and fraud.
Right, yeah, that would work.
Oh man, it's up to you. How do you want to be introduced?
Oh, just Rose. Dude you know from Discord. That would be like the most accurate representation of this.
Could you guys just kind of describe very generally what the state of El Salvador's economy was prior to the introduction of the Bitcoin law? Because I know there's some pros and cons. Like, I know I have my own personal bias, but I know by some measures things actually did improve starting in 2022.
I'm not an economist by any means, but Salvador's economy has fluctuated a lot. I think in 2001 went through like a dollarization of its economy, so it has a history with different currencies, and it recently last year has seen some improvements, especially in the GDP and unemployment, actually, so more people employed. But I wouldn't say that it's still a stable economy. A lot of people just live off of informal economy, but specifically in El Salvador, the rate of, like, for example, a lot of people didn't have a bank account, and most of the transactions are done in cash.
A lot of the money that's coming through back to El Salvador, it's being done through Western Union, because the numbers on how many people are banked, it's like less than 40%. You have to send it in cash, and sending cash through Western Union itself has a premium on it. At the time, like, it was anywhere from $8 to $18, although I've seen some like crazier numbers than that. Generally speaking, you're going to take a haircut, regardless of anything else, and you're going to take a haircut on an average of millions of people and millions of dollars.
I guess, I mean, if you look at the numbers, unemployment has decreased and GDP has increased. But still, it was heavily reliant on external cash inflow, so it's highly in debt. Or has high levels of external debt. So, IMF. And that was at least also in the context in which, I guess we're going to talk about it later, in which the infamous Bitcoin law was introduced.
So, Rose, you might have some insight into this. When I was talking with Alessia, she mentioned that aside from all the other factors we're talking about here, that El Salvador also has a lot of external debt, and also something about how they owe a lot of money in bonds as well.
I mean, the Chivo wallet itself is going to be a cascading event of failures, which I think we're going to get into. But the bonds themselves seem like they could have been the bigger problem if it wasn't for the crypto crash. Again, the crypto crash occurred in 2022. Something that they very specifically, some sources at least cite, was the fact that Russia invaded Ukraine, being, as well as the financial downturn in the markets, being like a lot of the reasons why a lot of the bonds were postponed. Like, they're still being postponed well into 2024. Like, we are likely going to see them occurring now. The new digital regulations basically only passed recently, I mean in January 2024. And this is when we're starting to see the first real steps towards bringing a lot of this stuff to market in terms of like tokenized bonds.
I just wanted to take an aside here to explain what a tokenized bond is, because it was kind of a new concept to me as well, and I forgot to ask Rose to explain it in his own words. It's basically an approach to managing national debt that El Salvador is trying. So they're digital bonds, and they're created on blockchain platforms, which they say will enhance liquidity and transparency and allow for 24/7 trading. But I think the big thing is they were hoping that this could attract investment from outside the country. And by increasing the investor base, they could provide the government with more capital so that it can actually meet its debt obligations. So basically, it's kind of breaking up the bonds so it's a little easier for the government to digest. But with it, again, is just a bunch of regulatory and technical challenges. And that sort of necessitated the passing of these laws that he's referring to. So basically, it's another finger in the dam, but it required the government to set up a whole other infrastructure to support. And this additional infrastructure seems to be another cause for the delay in paying back what the government owes its citizens, and I guess those outside the country who they'd owe money to. But yeah, anyway, back to Rose explaining this financial disaster.
Like, again, they were repeatedly pushing it back again and again and again. It was supposed to initially launch in the middle of 2022. And then, of course, in February, Russia invaded Ukraine. The financial markets kind of took a very wild turn, as well as the fact that by that point, the crypto market was, like, the bottom was starting to fall out of the crypto market. So they started pushing them back because the actual structure of the bonds was, it was going to be $1 billion for Bitcoin. Half of it was going to be used to purchase more Bitcoin, and the other half was going to go into the infrastructure of Bitcoin City. So Bitfinex is doing the underwriting, and Blockstream is like handling the development of the bond itself. And the numbers they're saying are absolutely insane.
Wait, so you're saying that they entrusted these national bonds to blockchain companies? Don't they kind of have an inherent incentive to misrepresent the prospect of this investment?
So they were saying that there was going to be a possibility of 146% annualized yield based on the idea that Bitcoin was going to hit $1 million by the end of the 10 years.
Wait, just so I got this straight. So they told the government that they could make this investment under the assumption that by 2031, Bitcoin be worth $1 million.
Yes.
Jesus.
And to put this in perspective, like, the U.S. Treasury kind of gets like 1.5% annualized yield.
Okay, I feel like we're starting to lose the thread here because I was originally just asking about how much debt El Salvador was in, and we got onto the topic of the bonds, and I didn't realize till I talked to you and Alessia that, like,
that's the problem. So much about this is kind of tangled up into so many different points. Like, you poke one thing and you get like a spider's nest of insanity because, okay, we're talking about the annualized yield returns. A second shadow on all of this is the fact that El Salvador also has like dollar bonds that are going to come due in 2023 and 2025.
Oh, so some of these dollar bonds already matured.
Yes. Now, admittedly, they were able to pay for them, but it also involved, by some context I've seen, that a lot of austerity measures. But yeah, no, it's like the bonds. I would heavily recommend looking into the bonds.
Yeah, I mean, that's insane. Like, using another financial disaster to just have another grift going. Or maybe it's not even a grift at this point. Maybe it's just clever of them. I don't know. It's like, it's nuts. I took a little bit of a look into this myself about these austerity measures. And I think it's important to remember that this was also happening during the COVID-19 pandemic. But yeah, here comes the IMF involvement here. The IMF stepped in with several recommendations aimed at restoring stability. So they had to increase tax collection, optimize public spending, and prioritize infrastructure projects to get help from the IMF. So in response to the Salvadoran government cut public spending that they deemed non-essential. For instance, they cut spending on public services such as, housing, healthcare, and education, and that significantly impacted vulnerable populations. According to Human Rights Watch, the cuts were said to contribute to an increase in extreme poverty by 0.3% and affected 8.7% of Salvadorans. According to Amnesty International, the reduction in social spending and public services exacerbated a number of issues related to poverty and social exclusion. I'm not going to say that the IMF and everything they've ever done ever has been bad in every single situation or in every single outcome, but this is the kind of punching down that happens when these massive financial institutions get involved in things that affect real people's lives. This is what they're talking about when they say spending optimization. So this is another classic case of, well, the number go up, so it looks good for investors, but it's not necessarily translating to something stable or useful to everyday people. So there's a bit to unpack here. There's an unstable economy at home that has its own fluctuations. There's reliance on the extra income that could be afforded from Salvadorans working in the US, and a significant portion of that income is being taken from them. I guess it's only natural that someone could see that there is a need to be met, and for the cynical, that means a business opportunity. Okay, so to just briefly re-summarize and just take the ship in for a landing, the Chivo Wallet and Bitcoin law story began well before the Bitcoin law was introduced in 2021. El Salvador's economy was marked by significant instability and reliance on external cash flows. A substantial portion of the country's GDP, some estimates saying up to 26%, was derived from remittances sent by Salvadorans living abroad, primarily in the US. This dependence on remittances was compounded by a low banking penetration within the country. Less than 40% of the population had bank accounts. Consequently, many transactions were conducted in cash or relied on remittance services like Western Union, which charge high fees. This further strains the economic resources of ordinary Salvadorans. Additionally, the economy had been dollarized since 2001, which provided some stability, but also exposed the country to fluctuations in the US economy. There's a generous interpretation of where this is going. The government's pivot into cryptocurrency, the tokenized bonds, and using the Bitcoin law, it could be seen as an attempt to modernize the financial system and reduce transaction costs. But as you'll see where this story is going, did it introduce new risks? Before we get into the details of Chivo Wallet and its origins, though, let's talk more broadly about El Salvador's history with cryptocurrency, with blockchain, and, specifically with Bitcoin. This next part is going to be a lot of back and forth between Rose and I, specifically about cryptocurrency and, again, like how it got brought on a grand scale to El Salvador. So I understand that this isn't a cryptocurrency podcast per se. I think it's still extremely important to building the context for kind of the thrust of the thesis of this episode. So prior to Chivo Wallet, how much was Bitcoin even used in El Salvador? Was there like a central figure or a major organization that kind of pushed it? Some company or...
So on the Bitcoin side of things, you got to look at a guy named Mike Peterson. There's going to be other people involved in the Bitcoin Beach project, but I'm focusing on Mike Peterson because he's kind of the nexus point of a lot of stuff.
Just an aside, Bitcoin Beach was a 2019 project. It was supposedly a community-led initiative in El Zante, a coastal village in El Salvador. The project was started to create a sustainable Bitcoin economy in the village specifically, with the goal of financial inclusion for the unbanked population. The initiative provided the local community with Bitcoin wallets and supported businesses in accepting Bitcoin as payment. So it was basically a testing ground for what would come for Bitcoin adoption. And what Rose is referring to here is how several figures and forces kind of came together in Bitcoin Beach.
So he's Californian. He graduated from a Christian college. This is going to come into play in a little bit. And he owns like a food services company back in Cali. He is on the ground in El Salvador since at least 2004, on the ground most of the year from 2005 onwards. There's this company, this sort of organization he co-founds with his wife called Mission Sake. It's a rename from something called the Missionary Fellowship. I believe the full name is called El Salvador Missionary Fellowship. It's this sort of support organization for missionaries in the country, in Central America in general. They do a lot of their own things, like English classes, that kind of stuff. Now, the way Mission Sake comes into play is that they hold this yearly gathering that they call The Gathering. So in 2019, he calls him a representative, but it sounds like a cutout of an anonymous Bitcoin whale at one of these gatherings.
I don't mean to derail you, but
go ahead.
Is this Bitcoin whale going to come up later? Like, do we have any idea who it might be? I think you understand how mysterious this sounds.
Not from the little digging I did. Like, he remains anonymous, and he's a very pivotal figure, but he really just kicks in once. Like, he might have showed up a few more times kicking in money, but at the end of the day, everyone kept it. This is the story that's told over and over again. Like, an anonymous Bitcoin whale, through a cutout, through a representative, says, I will give you $100,000 in Bitcoin, but they have to stay in Bitcoin. Now, the actual request, it varies depending on the interview. But generally speaking, it's like you got to use the Bitcoin as it is for a project. And what Mike Peterson comes back with, or the recommendation that the guy gives, is a circular economy, which is how Bitcoin Beach starts.
Could you just explain what you mean by a circular economy a little bit?
So they want to get people using Bitcoin, not getting Bitcoin, selling it off, and moving back to fiat. They want people buying food with Bitcoin, and then people getting paid in Bitcoin, and then people using the Bitcoin in other places in this location. Because with Bitcoin, people hold, they sell when it's high, but they need it to be used like an actual currency, not just an asset, like a stock. And this is what this guy wants out of Bitcoin. And what, actually, to be perfectly frank, Mike Peterson sort of delivers, at least on the scale that he's operating on.
Yeah, like just in the town of El Zonte. And can you just paint the picture a little bit at El Zonte? Just kind of describe it.
El Zonte, it's part of the El Salvador coast, like a good surfing spot. And he basically starts onboarding local businesses with, they can use Bitcoin. He starts paying like people with Bitcoin. He actually gets it going. And it's actually fairly successful, especially with a COVID kicking off at the same time, where suddenly people don't necessarily want to exchange dollars.
So wait, and this is Mike Peterson, the guy you mentioned before.
Yes. Generally speaking, he's been on the ground for a long time. He knows locals. And I mean, he's been there at this point for 15 years.
Like, how is he doing this?
Oh, just locals who cater to the tourists, basically.
Okay, but how are they exchanging it at this point? Because I know Chivo, in theory, is supposed to make this easier.
Yeah.
But at this point, what methods are they using, if you know?
Mostly just pre-made, like wallets you can get online on your phones. And there's going to be more infrastructure that comes in. This is actually how Athena Bitcoin comes into the picture.
And Athena, they do like the Bitcoin ATMs, right? And what year are we in at this point?
Around 2020 is when it really starts kicking off into 2022. He says it's around 18 months. Like there's an 18-month span from, if I remember correctly, when Bitcoin launches. So September 7th for like 18 months previously. But 2020 is definitely a time when it's occurring, like when this entire project's getting off the ground. And again, it's fairly successful for what it is. Like again, people went to the ground. They interviewed some of the people involved, like the locals who run some of the local businesses, and there's mixed responses. But compared to what's coming next, this is a resounding success.
I feel like there's an implication here that maybe a famous tourist spot that attracts a lot of foreign money doesn't translate as an example to a whole country that's majorly impoverished.
But generally speaking, this project starts getting attention from the government as well as like Bitcoiners internationally. And this is sort of where Jack Mallers enters the picture.
And who is that?
Guy, I'm trying to think of a better word for this, but the guy kind of, I refer to him as like finance nobility. Like his grandfather was the chairman of the Chicago Board of Trade. His father was a futures broker and apparently started one of the biggest brokerages in the city, but that's just from people kind of like fluff pieces. They also own a cannabis shop, but that's neither here nor there.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm just trying really, really hard not to think too much about specific economists from the city of Chicago having potentially negative involvement in Latin American countries.
So his father introduced him to crypto when he was like 13, and the guy primarily works in like the Lightning ecosystem, the Lightning network.
Okay, you're gonna have to tell me a little bit about what the Lightning network is. As I understand, it has something to do with basically trying to fix some of the speed problems with Bitcoin or something.
So what Lightning basically is like a miniature transaction channel. It's basically like a side little channel. Instead of having to make every single individual transaction that you and another person are going to do on the main blockchain, which is kind of slow and charges like a severe fee depending on how much money you're sending, you're doing these little mini transactions within like this isolated little channel between you and another person.
Okay, I could see it having some privacy uses as well.
Right. And the only way for it, because all these transactions, they're being recorded within the channel, but they're not being recorded on the main blockchain. So when you shut the channel down, the amount of money on either side of it, how much money you have, how much the other person on the channel has, that is the final amount recorded to the actual blockchain. So the way it works on a scaling level is that once you're connected to someone and you want to send a transaction to someone entirely else, you don't have to do the initial fee to create a channel if they themselves have a link of connections that lead to you. Jack created a Zap wallet. That was the first project he had. It was kind of a GUI for the Lightning Network. Then he created the Olympus, like this, just a piece of software to make onboarding people onto crypto a lot easier. Just using your actual bank account instead of having to go through all these issues of having to go to an exchange or find some other way to get a hold of Bitcoin. And finally, there's the Strike wallet. Now, what the Strike wallet is, it's supposed to make cross-border transactions a lot easier. Like, you connect it to your bank account, you send money, it buys Bitcoin, the Bitcoin is shot over to the other wallet, which is hopefully a Strike wallet, and then it get converted to dollars. And then and that's the very important part. Like, they immediately convert it to currency. So the Bitcoin fluctuation should not affect you. And when you want to cash out, you buy Bitcoin again and cash it out in an ATM. That was the system that they had in place when they got to El Salvador.
So it actually kind of seems like a perfect storm of people and capabilities for, at least temporarily, solving the immediate problems that anybody trying to participate in the economy might have in El Salvador. I can see where this is going, and it is more logical than I expected.
This is the most important one. But yeah, basically, you connect your bank account to the Strike wallet. You want to send money to another country. It buys Bitcoin, sends it over, converts it to a local currency, and if you want to cash out, the money gets turned into Bitcoin and you cash it out in an ATM. That is the system that is in place when he goes to El Salvador. Now, of course, there's also a side note to this that legality-wise, there was
Allegedly
a lot of murky areas when he brought this system to El Salvador. So instead of dollars, the currencies were being held in Tether.
Okay, so this is just more of a crypto shell game.
Yes. And again, this is post a lot of their liquidity, like questions about their liquidity. So yeah, that's a tangent of a tangent. So he's in the country, and Strike is sort of... It starts getting a little bit of notice as a way for minances to occur. Because, again, there is some fees, but it's less, and it's fast. And according to the story that he tells, that they were getting, like, attention on TV, and one of Bukele's brothers contacts him so that he can come and meet Bukele in person.
Okay, so just to recap, we have Bitcoin Beach, a project largely seeded by an enigmatic, unnamed Bitcoin whale who charged missionary turned entrepreneur Mike Patterson with propagating the idea of a circular Bitcoin economy at a coastal tourist town, El Zonte. The experiment seems to garner a mixed response from locals, but overall seems successful throughout 2020. It seemed timely as well, considering the COVID-19 pandemic was adding a complication to a traditionally cash-driven economy. The project starts to draw the attention of the cryptocurrency community internationally, the government, and Jack Mallers, a financial maven who holds the key to a number of
allegedly
questionably legal innovations that address many of the immediate challenges facing Salvadorans. The excitement generated at the so-called Bitcoin Beach and Maller's innovations eventually were enough to attract the involvement of the millennial president himself, Nayib Bukele. I think there's more than one way to interpret this. Salvadorans had to be brought into the 21st century somehow, and they had to do it in more empowering terms than we've seen play out in other places in the global south. Perhaps this was a technological solution to a number of their problems. However, and we're only scratching the surface so far, we'll find that the administration and a number of the people around them have their own ties to foreign governments, foreign corporations, and financial interests that I'd argue are only less dangerous than the IMF because of their scale. From what I've heard from Rose, Alessia, and the sources they've shown me so far, what went down in the early days of El Salvador's Bitcoin experiment strikes me as more of a confluence of drifting opportunists than high-minded planning by innovative altruists.
I mean, even let's look at it in the most positive light and go like, it is like a solution that's being presented. And again, this is like 2021. Crypto has infected the mainstream. Like the Larry David commercial is like the most infamous thing. I think that happens in 2022 though. But like it's infected the mainstream. Like it's big, especially because of the pandemic where suddenly everyone has like a little bit of money to spend. Yeah, and they were using their stimulus checks on crypto. Like crypto was in the mainstream in a big way. And again, this is all from interviews and stories in hindsight. Again, this is like him giving an interview going like, yeah, the strike was on the TV and people were talking about it. He might be hyping himself up. But again, if you're paying attention to those circles, he was making a bit of a splash. Because at this point, he was like a player in the game. Like a big player in the game. So he meets with the president. Like he gives these stories about how like they both showed up in hoodies. They talked about anime and life and things like that. And you sort of fast forward to like the Bitcoin 2021 and Jack Mallers is on stage pacing back and forth, crying about how this is going to be like, this is going to change the world. Like fix the money, fix the world. And Bukele appears on screen behind him and announces that they are planning to make Bitcoin a legal tender in the country.
He like announced it at a cryptocurrency convention somewhere, in Miami. And it sort of like took everybody by surprise because everybody was like, what do you mean you want to make a legal tender? And I remember the attention that it caught internationally because also, I mean, El Salvador is a relatively small country. Like people didn't really talk about it much in international news media. And all of a sudden, like El Salvador was everywhere.
I'm president of El Salvador. Great ideas are beautiful and have great power. But like most beautiful things, they can also be more fragile than we think. When I was a kid, we thought about the future and we were delighted by its possibilities. We couldn't wait for it to happen and be part of its creation. But now, ask almost anyone what they think about the future and they will say something along the lines of nuclear war, climate catastrophe, hunger, pestilence, the death of life. We didn't take care of the beautiful idea that we create our own future, that we as humanity can do almost anything that we imagine. Our ingenuity, what separates us from other species. In El Salvador, we are trying to rescue this idea and start the design of a country for the future, using the best ingredients that makes us who we are, while using sensibility to find the best examples of ideas from history and around the world. I believe Bitcoin could be one of these ideas. That is why next week, I will send to Congress a bill that will make Bitcoin a legal tender in El Salvador. In the short term, this will generate jobs and help provide financial inclusion to thousands outside the formal economy. And in the medium and long term, we hope that this small decision can help us push millions of this economy into the right direction.
First, to these people in Miami. Not to his own people, to these people in Miami. Maybe there were inklings on the ground, but basically he unveils this plan first to the people in Miami who are at this Bitcoin conference. Like, this is where it gets revealed. In the video itself, he's speaking English. And again, this is Bitcoin 2021. This is like a very big conference. It's not post the pandemic, but it's post where you couldn't get anything going in terms of congregated spaces. So this is big. And this is where he reveals his plan to make Bitcoin a legal tender.
So when I hear this, I have to question how much the focus of Chivo was truly on banking the unbanked, as they said, the unbanked working class of El Salvador. I mean, think about it. The president of the country himself making a video announcement in English at a conference for Bitcoin enthusiasts and investors that are outside the country. Where my head immediately goes is he's either desperate for foreign investment, as we mentioned before, the country has a lot of debt and bonds that were maturing at this time, or this is way more about Bitcoin and way less about the working class. And another thought, and Rose and I discuss this later on, and hopefully I'll include this. In my understanding of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency in general, the idea of just replacing a fiat with another fiat, because I mean, if the government's going to be controlling the wallets in the first place and mandating it through law that it has to be accepted, if it's not freely exchanged, isn't that against the principles that Bitcoin was founded on in the first place? Isn't this actually, at the end of the day, just, you could say for good reason or not, just laundering the money? But it's understandable, right? Break up the bonds, get foreign investors excited by any means necessary, get your country on the map as a smart place for investment. A lot of this may factor into the authoritarian shift the administration would turn towards, as we'll discuss later. A final thought I have on this is, well, by making these things public in this way, outside of his country, sort of letting investors officially know before anyone else, it could give Bukele's ambitions for Bitcoin added weight, and put pressure on any politicians who might try to hold him back. This might all sound kind of alarmist and tinfoil hat of me, but just wait, because this is only half the plot so far surrounding the questionable launch of Chivo.
And for a long time, people were just like, yeah, but he's not going to do it. Like, why would he do it? And then in September, he passed the law and the Bitcoin became legal tender. And people in shops, technically, businesses, were supposed to, they must accept the Bitcoin because it becomes just another currency. But actually, I think the data shows that that's really not the case. I mean, he announced it in, I think it was June, somewhere around June, and then the law was passed in September, right? So between June and September, he and his party create the text of the law that then was passed by the Legislative Assembly. So, I mean, obviously there was some time in between, but I think the first time when he mentioned it, it was quite a surprise. I don't know how much for the people in Salvador, because it was quite vocal anyway on Twitter.
So, like, Bitcoin law passes a couple days later, 8th of June, 62 of 84 votes. There's some people who abstain, but again, that's a majority, 62 of 84 votes. Chivo is announced in the interim, like the 24th of June.
Okay, and before we get into the launch of the software proper, I remember reading in some of your sources that there was even more to the foreign influence angle of the Chivo wallet launch. I know there are a lot of so-called global south countries that are looking into the potential for, or have been actively working with cryptocurrencies around the world for use in things sometimes as nefarious as dodging sanctions. The most notable example of that being North Korea, who just outright steal Bitcoin as as a standard practice. But also I know Venezuela has been accused of working with Tether-related products to get around sanctions they're anticipating from countries like the US. I remember seeing that the pretty reputable El Faro news site talked about the involvement of Venezuelans in the early days of Chivo Wallet. Is this just conspiracy brain, or is there something to this?
So the Venezuelan connection comes in because apparently there's a shadow council of around 20 Venezuelans that surround Bukele,
Allegedly,
who are above any of the official ministers and might be just below his own brothers in terms of who he's willing to listen to.
Oh, you know how that sounds, right, man?
I mean, okay, so one of the main, again, a lot of this information comes from El Faro.
Yeah, they've kind of famously been a thorn in the administration's side.
And there's enough overlap in some of the other stuff that's going to come up that I am inclined to believe them. The main figure of note is Sarah Hanna. Yeah, she's a dentist from Venezuela, is tied into, like, the opposition parties. So Sarah Hanna herself, she's heavily tied into a guy named Leopoldo Lopez. So this is a guy he's a Venezuelan politician. He's had like a lot of shit flung at him by the Venezuelan government itself. I don't know enough about the situation on the ground to say whether or not it's deserved. Like he gets accused of graft. An international court says that he didn't do it, but the international court is also seems to be American influence. There's this entirety of thing, but he's firmly an opposition figure, and Sarah Hanna is tied into him and tied into his wife Lilian Tintori. She seems to be like the handle organization for her. And again, these Venezuelans pop up again and again. But basically, there's a shadow council of Venezuelans surrounding Bukele who seem to be only below his brothers, and a lot of El Salvadoran politicians and officials anonymously say that we basically, if you don't have a direct line to him, you basically are under these people. They're not elected and they're just there. And he keeps putting them in charge of things. They were in charge of the COVID response, according to El Faro. And they show up repeatedly in regards to the Chivo wallet. So I do believe them when they say that they were also put in charge of the Chivo wallet development.
That's really interesting. And it also kind of plays into this construction I have in my head of Bukele just running the country like another gang.
Yeah. But yeah, that's basically what the Venezuelan connection is, and they play like a very prominent part, especially in the launch, but also at the same time it's like this is an entire political situation I do not have remotely any context for, and it just you poke it in like just every single thing about this, you poke it a little bit and you just get like a bundle of different wires running off in all directions.
And just from an aside, what I've been able to read later, I'll pull this little summary up from just a translated article about the whole situation. So about the Venezuelan advisors, this group is primarily composed of individuals connected to Leopoldo Lopez's party, the Voluntad Popular, which got mentioned before. Hannah, alongside other advisors like Lester Toledo, was involved in Bukele's campaign and continues to influence government decisions. According to investigative reports, and it cites 3 other publications besides Alfaro, this group operates in a way that goes beyond the cabinet, often answering directly to Bukele himself. They're involved in various aspects of government, with each advisor overseeing specific sectors such as health, education, and economic policies. For instance, Juan Carlos Gutierrez, another Venezuelan advisor, was involved in transparency efforts and has ties to the OAS International Committee Against Impurity in El Salvador. The team has faced criticism for their extensive control and the way they give orders within Salvadoran ministries. Reports suggest that their influence has caused concern among local government officials who feel sidelined by the Venezuelan advisor's authority. So that's it for the political conspiracy side of things for now. Now we're going to move into more the technical details and shortcomings of Chivo Wallet itself.
But yeah, so Chivo Wallet, that is roughly the Venezuelan connection. There's more details there for other people to jump into, but it was something that had to be briefly brought up because they play such a prominent role in a lot of these incidents. But yeah. So the Chivo Wallet itself, it's announced the 24th of June, about 16 days after the law is passed. And the purpose is to facilitate the use of Bitcoin among Salvadorians. So, crypto wallets, a very brief primer. And again, the technical side of things is not my go-to, more the legal side of stuff. But it's basically the combination of, like, a crypto wallet in general is basically the combination of your checking account and the actual app that the bank provides you with to interact with said checking account. At the minimum, you should be able to use this piece of software and receive, send, and view how much crypto is associated with your current wallet address. So, functions, you got your public key and your private key. Your public key, post it anywhere you'd like. People can send Bitcoin or ETH or any other altcoin to that address. Like, that is not the issue. The private key is the important part, because with your private key, that's how people can get crypto out of your wallet. Yeah, that's why you'll hear all these stories about how there's like millions of dollars of Bitcoin stuck on a USB. The Bitcoin's not stuck on the USB. The private key is what is stuck on the USB, and the private key is an insane amount of letters to figure out. Now we're simplifying things a lot. You got custodial, non-custodial. Custodial, the organization, the person, the group, whatever, they're holding your private key for you. And non-custodial, your private key is yours, good luck. So the Chivo wallet itself, it's a custodial wallet, which is honestly the smartest option for this entire thing.
Well, that's assuming they're actually securing your shit.
Yeah. Yeah, which what we're about to get into is not what it's about. But it can send, buy, receive, and it can hold both dollar amounts and crypto. Well, specifically Bitcoin. It's a Bitcoin wallet, but it can also hold dollar amounts, which is going to play into an incident that happens roughly a year after it launches. So this is the main idea. And again, it's announced the 24th of June, and the plan is to launch it September 7th.
Wait, to make a secure banking app that services the entire country and facilitates foreign transactions. That's not a lot of time.
Yes, it is. It is not a lot of time at all.
What did you learn about the companies involved with the development and the launch? Because I know a lot of this stuff, people are going to kind of need to know the difference between some of the companies involved, because some of the drama is the conflict between a few of them.
So, okay. So Athena is sort of the nexus point of everything.
Yeah, and like I said before, so they did the ATMs and the actual physical interface for the people to use day to day.
Then Bitso, Binance, these are other companies that are also involved.
Oh yeah, famously uncontroversial Binance. So I know Bitso has a good reputation as, I think, the best crypto exchange in Latin America and one of the best ones in the world.
So Bitso itself, Mexican crypto exchange, and even in hindsight, probably the best choice for this. They were handling custodial and like exchange aspects of Chivo alongside Binance. And like the thing, again, this is 2021. Nothing's gone wrong yet in the crypto industry. But the thing to note about them specifically is that they were at the time tied in with Silvergate Bank and Ripple. So Ripple is currently fighting for its life against the SEC. Like they are getting fined like. They're trying to get fined. SEC is trying to fine them for like $2 billion. And they are fighting for their life right now. And Silvergate collapsed in the wake of FTX. But again, this is only in hindsight. At the time, Bitso was a good choice, as well as Binance. Of course, there's some shady stuff known about Binance at the time, but this was 2021. Yeah, like I said, even in hindsight, Bitso looks good. It's just that these two ties that immediately leapt to the attention. But that's just a side note of a side note. Again, in hindsight, Bitso was a decent enough choice. Like it was probably the best choice they could have made considering they're a Central American country. Athena entered through Bitcoin Beach. They're setting up the ATMs and they're handling like the main infrastructure of the wallet itself. According to one article, but then again, they're quoting this is the CEO of the company itself saying this. Like a mutual friend of his and Mike Peterson's brought him in to provide the ATMs for Bitcoin Beach. And that's how he enters El Salvador. They're handling like the main wallet infrastructure and things are about to go horribly wrong in that regard. So again, the development itself leaks like a sieve in the lead up to the actual launch. Like the back end is leaked, but the most like big inflection point or the biggest point where things start getting a little bit worrisome is when Mario Gomez gets arrested. So he is a general crypto critic. The way he went about it made him sound like he was mostly pointing out the contradictions that are present in El Salvador implementing Bitcoin as legal tender. But in some of the interviews I've seen, he does come off as like a broader critic of capitalism in general. But the way he handled his arguments is generally speaking just very pointedly pointing out the contradictions found in El Salvador, bringing in Bitcoin as legal tender. Generally speaking, that this is going to be centralized within the El Salvadoran government. Yeah, this decentralized coin, which is supposed to be free of a state, being primarily handled by the state of El Salvador for the people. And the fact that the Chivo wallet itself is another attempt at centralization, because instead of trying to get people to use their own wallet, they're heavily pushing everyone to use the official state-sanctioned wallet of Chivo, to the point of like offering $30 of Bitcoin for signing up. Like, again, it's like this is supposedly a decentralized thing that is being heavily centralized under the El Salvadoran government. And again, you're mouthing off in a big way. People are supporting you. This is something that might get you in trouble. But he gets arrested driving his mother to work. Depending on the version of the telling, he either gets stopped at a barricade or they just straight up come for him. But it's always the same. He's with his mom. And he's taking his mom to work. That is like a constant. The way people tell the stories vary, but that never does. Like, I'm taking my mom to work and the cops came for me. They arrest him, take his phones, and then they try to take his laptop from his mother. And that is only stopped by the fact that she refused to hand it over. And at that point, they've raised enough of a ruckus that there's media attention and generally just eyes on the situation. So they can't get his laptop, but they get his phones.
Is there a chance that he got Pegasus like all those El Faro employees?
I mean, he fled the country soon afterwards. Because, again, he's being accused, he's saying, hey, possible bank fraud, like just you're doing some kind of thing related to the financial system that's like an outright crime. That is the excuse they use to bring him in. But they quietly release him, like afterwards. Like it's a point he makes that like they just kind of give me they drive me out of there as quietly as humanly possible and they let me go. And he ends up having to flee the country. He makes a point of saying like the media attention was a very big part of why things didn't go worse for me. So again, they say it's because of possible bank fraud. What everyone sort of points to as maybe the bigger reason was that a couple of days before, they were doing a presentation on the Chivo wallet. He made a tweet. This is the thing. This is where everything sort of stems from. They had a slide on LinkedIn with a QR code. And when you scanned the QR code, it was a wallet that was used in 2020 during a Twitter hack of prominent accounts. And they, like around more than $110,000 was stolen during these. and sent to that wallet. And again, there might not be anything nefarious about any of this. This might just be like, again, a lot of the sources say, hey, this could have just been a lazy intern. This could have just been somebody who got bored and just looked for the first result for a QR code for a wallet. And this would have been in the news, like in a big way.
Oh no, so this was like on TV?
But it's also immediately followed by this guy getting arrested after he tweets out this fact. Me pidieron revisar la dirección de Bitcoin.
They asked me to review the Bitcoin address that appears in the Chivo Wallet presentation they uploaded to LinkedIn. The address is the same one Twitter hackers used when they stole Elon Musk's account. A slide with an address with illicit funds does not help Chivo, eh? I just wanted to chime in here and say that Mario Gomez seems like a really interesting character in Latin America's tech and activism spaces. It seems like he's still active as both an organizer and a crypto-critical tech enthusiast with a lot of interest in human rights and anti-colonialism. I barely use Twitter anymore, but it's cool to see some mutual follows there. I haven't found anything written by him in English long form since 2022, where he used to publish a crypto hater newsletter on Substack. It's important to note that I'm trying to isolate his particular political criticisms of Chivo within a snapshot of his life. I mean, I kind of get the impression he might have even come at this even harder now than he did back then. I'm also trying to make sure these criticisms don't get lost in translation. I just want you to keep in mind that this is kind of limited to things found in the press in late 2021, early 2022. While this isn't like an episode that's specifically or strictly about him, I could see how he might come up in some future episodes based on some of the other work that he's done. And hey, I kind of hope I cross paths with the guy. And for now, just to clarify, I confirmed that the incident with the QR code that Rose is referring to did happen shortly before he was arrested, as far as I can tell, the same day. If you want to see more about Mario Gomez and kind of like a retrospective on the whole Bitcoin law situation, he did a really interesting interview in Jacobin on June 25th, 2022. It's a retrospective from almost a year later. So yeah, check that out. So yeah, to kind of summarize his criticisms of Chivo in 3 pieces. On the tech side, Gomez noted that numerous technical problems with the Chivo wallet, including difficulties in verifying user identities and widespread instances of identity theft impacting the launch. He mentioned that the wallet system for verifying identities has been flawed from the beginning, as we're about to see. Transparency. He expressed concerns about the potential misuse of user data by the government and the lack of transparency in how the Bitcoin funds are managed. Gomez argued that the government had not been clear about how it is handling the funds and protecting user information, which, judging by the title of this episode, you kind of see where that goes. This is going to come back up later and actually encapsulates a number of the criticisms the hacktivists in cyberintelligentsia have as well. And on the economic side, Gomez's personal beliefs aside, he was skeptical about the viability of Bitcoin for everyday transactions in El Salvador, particularly for low-income individuals. He points out that the volatility of Bitcoin makes it unsuitable for small businesses and daily transactions, which rely on stable pricing to manage their operations effectively. Just kind of mash that together from a September 1st article on Decrypt by Jose Antonio Lance and a November 2021 article by Marianela Vanchi in Spanish language outlet Crypto Noticias. I just want to apologize to the third of the planet that speaks Spanish.
No, he's out of the country. That's actually where Easy Money catches up to him. It's a book by Ben McKenzie, of all people, the guy from Gotham. But he's on the ground, like in the US now. I don't know if he's still there currently, but he had to get out of the country after this.
So I'm wondering if they were willing to go against a media figure like Gomez, who in the grand scheme of things wasn't even that huge of a deal. Like, what would they do to a major outlet? I know that mid-2021 was kind of the height of the alleged use of Pegasus spyware and other harassment against the El Faro newsroom. Was El Faro at all involved with the criticism of the Bitcoin law at the time? I'm just curious. I'm pretty sure I know what the answer is going to be.
Yeah, pretty much near constantly. Like, they served as the source for a lot of stuff even pre-launch. September 6, 2021, behind Bitcoin and the Chivo wallet, there are also Venezuelans. Like, they are covering this extensively. And then again, they were also, well before this, just posting articles critical of Bukele. So, again, they posted about Bitcoin, but they were probably already on the target board well before that.
Now, this is just me trying to, like, devil's advocate about this, but I know El Faro has outside of El Salvador a great reputation, but in situations like this, like there is always that risk of outside looking in confirmation bias, especially when looking at publications from the so-called global south. This is a topic that, if they were, let's say, muckrakers, yellow journalists or whatever, they were just like looking for a juicy topic. I mean, this would be an easy target. So their reputation aside, how inclined are you to believe them?
While it's important to bring up the Venezuelan connection, again, I don't know about their El Salvador's history with Venezuela at all, or a lot of the context. It's just that they keep popping up, and the main source for it is El Faro. But there's enough of an overlap with other stuff that I am inclined to believe them. But yeah, they were definitely covering Bitcoin, and they were going hard on the Venezuelan connection as well.
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate, like, while I try to go at this a little skeptically, I have seen no reason to doubt anything Alfaro has said, at least in any of the translations or any of the English-speaking social media, both from journalists and just regular news consumers and crypto followers, that there's any reason to think Alfaro isn't being completely honest. But the whole thing is just really interesting to follow, because I feel like the equivalent for me as somebody originally from the US, this is like learning about if Biden was surrounded by, or just say his cabinet was made up of 20 Canadians who all were fallouts from like the Canadian Conservative Party, and they just owned a bunch of finance companies that we coincidentally were using to implement a new digital currency and also, I don't know, like invest in new infrastructure in Ukraine or something. Like, it is that level of corruption involved here. And hey, I mean, kudos Alfaro for keeping on this even under the threat of intense government surveillance and harassment from organized crime.
Okay, funny you mentioned that,
oh,
actually.
God.
You know Lorenzo Rey, the person I specified?
Yeah, he's the Venezuelan guy who was supposed to help Bukele with Bitcoin City, which I hope we get to.
So Overton, who's going to show up in another thing with the Athena, he describes Lorenzo Rey as kind of like the CTO of the Venezuelan government. And the thing is, he was brought in off a previous crypto project that he ran, like 3 separate ones: Dash Help, Dash Merchant, and Dash Text, which were attempts to get the Dash cryptocurrency working in Venezuela. Lorenzo Rey specifically, he comes off these 3 different projects, and for the most part, none of the projects seem to have gotten off the ground. It seems like some aspects of it were outright lies, with reporters going to places that supposedly had Dash integration and finding absolutely nothing at all.
Lies in a crypto startup.
And he's brought in to sort of handle the launch of the Chivo Wallet. Like, again, they pop up in places of prominence. And you are getting this information from a guy who's involved in a lawsuit with Athena. So, of course, it might all just be hearsay. But there's too many overlaps, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense for this guy who's involved in a lawsuit with a separate company to buy into a fake conspiracy theory about Venezuelan shadow cabinets. The day of launch, right? David Gerald, who runs Attack at 50-Foot Bitcoin, he live tweeted the entire event, and he has an article just kind of summarizing the many, many disasters. But the basic timeline is that the wallet launches September 7th, 12 a.m. It goes on a Huawei store first. It launches 12 a.m. on that store and around 2 a.m. for Apple and Google. It starts to fail at 3 a.m. The overload is the reason that's brought up, like the KYC specifically. The KYC verification, it involves taking a picture of yourself after you put in your information, like either your DUI or your passport.
So basically, your 2 most important IDs would be uploaded to these servers.
And apparently the servers for the images immediately filled up. And this is going to come into play a little bit later, but they knew beforehand that the KYC was likely going to crash. They were told that it probably couldn't handle the amount of traffic that they were planning to put on it, but they went ahead anyways.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty easy thing for somebody who you'd presume would have a lot of engineering knowledge for a financial software platform to be able to calculate for.
And again, this is all from a single source, Overton, during his lawsuit. But considering what's about to happen, I am inclined to believe him due to the sheer cascading amount of failures that are about to come about. Because again, this is the day of launch. Like, we are just going off at 3 a.m., it starts crashing, and at 6 a.m., Bukele is on Twitter doing customer support. So the apps gets rapidly removed from the store, and it gets by 11 a.m. It's back on at least the Huawei store. By 11 a.m. it's back on that store, and they're doing gradual, slow rollouts. Like it's gonna hit the Google Play Store by 11 p.m. the day of. Now there are also Bitcoiners on the ground because this is like a momentous day, and they're recording their own adventures. And they're running into like ATMs that don't work. They're running into ATMs that ran out of cash. They're going into McDonald's that are supposed to be able to handle Bitcoin transactions and are having to like do troubleshootings like immediately and switching over to the Lightning Network to get their transactions through. And these are all people who are like deeply positive about this whole thing. To their credit, they are tweeting out the failures that they're encountering, as well as the successes they're encountering, but the failures are cascading when you look at the bigger picture.
Did it occur to any of these crypto enthusiasts that this is kind of exactly the opposite use case that Bitcoin was supposed to follow, and maybe that has something to do with why this isn't working too well?
But by like 2 p.m. the day of, ATM's running out of cash.
Well, yeah, everybody's trying to figure out how to get their $30 out.
And then we start talking about what you termed a watering hole.
Yeah, basically, in this situation, it was an act of negligence that was so bad it was like the equivalent of an intentional cyber attack. Yeah, so continue.
The private policy, the little link that always pops up with apps, it's linked to like a third-party site that has like official El Salvadorian government like markings, but isn't a government website. It's like a third-party site just created by a Venezuelan company.
Shocker.
It doesn't seem to be like a hijacking. It wasn't a hijacking. It wasn't like an attempt to do it. It just seems to be a poorly made website that they farmed out to like another company.
Yeah, and they didn't have SSL or TLS on the site.
No, the passwords are being sent over plain text HTTP with no SSL encryption.
Cool. So if you were a user that could even get on there, your information didn't stand a fucking chance.
Yeah, and again, this is David Gerald is a hater, and I'm not saying that dismissively.
Yeah, it's kind of like with Mario Gomez, where it's like a big chunk of his career is in hating on cryptocurrency. No, I gotcha.
But he's very much on the anti side of that, and I do have to respect his level of hating.
Okay.
But he also has the links to everything. He's backing it all up. Because if this is too much of a clown show that people are kind of doubtful, because again, it immediately started failing like an hour after hitting the Google store at 3 a.m. Who in the world is awake at 3 a.m.?
Yeah, people outside the country.
That's like a point made. How did the KYC immediately fail at 3 a.m.? Who is awake at 3 a.m.?
No, I know we're totally Monday morning quarterbacking. You're not an engineer. Like, we're all looking at this kind of now a couple years in the future. But do you think it was genuinely that bad of a piece of software, or do you think it was that many people from outside El Salvador?
Yeah, that's the funnier option would be it was genuinely that bad, but it might have been a combination of both, just people waiting to pounce. But I would actually believe that it was genuinely that bad, considering some of the stuff that's about to come up.
Okay, so let me get this straight again. To make a Chivo Wallet account, which a lot of people wanted to, if for no other reason, to get their 30 USD, you needed a valid state ID.
Your DUI, which is basically your ID, and I saw one source that said, like, as well as your passport number.
So yeah, in theory, if you're not a citizen or resident of El Salvador, you shouldn't be able to access Chivo Wallet at all.
Unless you have access to the DUIs, which apparently a lot of people did.
Yeah, I was going to say, it'd be a real shame if there weren't dozens of places I could think of off the top of my head on the dark web where you could probably get that information. And especially considering this going to like an unsecure site that didn't even have the most basic security, I'm starting to really doubt that they even really gave a shit about authenticating this. Just a quick aside here, you could find an English language Insight Crime article from October 2021 about how it was confirmed that the $30 Bitcoin bonuses at this time were being taken by what they call hackers. I'm not sure if this refers to people who just grabbed a tranche of stolen IDs off the dark web, or people who managed to find some way to directly attack the website to just bypass the account creation process. What the article makes clear, though, is that a lot of Salvadorans reported that when they tried to make an account for real, they were notified that their ID had already been used. I can tell you, without even doing research, from what Rose is telling me, is that both scenarios are highly likely. When I pull up my threat intelligence tool, hey guys, I'll name you for a sponsorship. The most basic search for Salvadoran data breaches has 3 incidents aside from the main one we'll discuss later, involving Salvadoran photo IDs. And this is only in the past 24 months. You got to remember too that because this wasn't $30 but $30 in Bitcoin, presumably, that once the money's gone, it's not coming back.
Yeah, but again, Overton specifically mentions that if you were able to get your hands on a Salvadorian IP, you could create the wallet.
Wait, so yeah, if you just have a photo ID or like something that you could just grab off of the dark web and then just VPN in, boom, you got it.
Yes, but again, the DUI was probably the biggest obstacle to that. Just knowing the number.
Yeah, but I guess like somebody who's like really been paying attention to this and really dedicated to committing fraud, especially over, say you find ways to access hundreds or thousands of accounts, like this doesn't seem like a very difficult thing to pull off. I wasn't sure where to put this aside in, but I did run a little experiment. Now this is, we're talking now mid-2024. To this day, there are still security issues that are very obvious with the Chivo Wallet app. Now it is on the Google Play Store, so in theory it should meet some kind of standard. That's, in theory, doing a lot of heavy lifting there. However, I was able to make a Chivo Wallet account, or at least like bypass the first layer of security by first just setting up a VPN, saying I was in El Salvador, then using a freely available Spanish phone number. And yeah, I was able to authenticate. This is the only financial app I've ever seen where I've been able to authenticate with a burner website phone number. Now, on top of that, you do need to get the DUI or photo ID verification to like finish creating the account, which I didn't do, but I did go online to see how easy it would be for me to find. And I won't say exactly where, there are still places you can find, not just from the leak in April by Cyber Intelligentsia. There are leaks from 2023 and earlier of photo IDs of Salvadorans, people in the Salvadoran military, all that stuff, that they're not dead links. So while one can assume that all these IDs have been used already to create illegitimate Chivo Wallet accounts, I got 70% of the way there without even really trying and zero financial investment.
The KYC is breaking apart immediately, and this is going to come in a little bit later about what you needed to do to defeat the picture portion of it. But the day of, like, you have all this stuff that's already happening, and then also Bitcoin chooses to crash like $10,000 day of. Again, at the time, still relatively high, still incredibly high, but that does not mean that the market conditions for Bitcoin in general were volatile with massive price swings. Now, it wasn't burning and crashing to a great degree. That's something that's only going to happen. That's going to happen within 8 months. But at this point, it crashed 10 grand, but it still came up in price. It still recovered slightly. But again, day of, if you didn't get your Bitcoin out fast enough, there's a very good chance that you could look at your $30 in Bitcoin and watch it dip between 25. That's like a very specific point that a lot of the very critical sources made, especially David Gerald. You were like, if you had $30 in Bitcoin, most likely you watched it dip be high, like beneath $25. That was the experience you had if you actually managed to get past all of this stuff that's happening, just general error messages and inability to use the KYC. That was the experience you had once you actually got this app working, to watch the price crash live on your phone.
Gotcha. So for anybody watching, they're going to feel compelled to pull out their money as soon as possible or do the exact opposite of what the government wanted and treat the Bitcoin like an asset rather than a currency. Either way, this is going to go completely against the model that was anticipated. Okay, and then this is when people started protesting, I presume?
To the protest, there's just a general undercurrent of anti-authoritarianism against Bukele, because he's making moves in the judiciary system to consolidate power.
Yeah, pin in that.
But again, there's the anti-authoritarianism undercurrent, but there's also just the fact that people were looking at the implementation of Bitcoin and they saw the very obvious issues with it, how volatile it was, how tech savvy you would have to be to interact with it to a degree. Again, a lot of this was supposed to be streamlined. Like, that's what the Chivo wallet was supposed to do. But to hold value in like Bitcoin, you either have to be someone who's very savvy with the markets, incredibly lucky, or borderline insane. Handling your finances in general is already a big ask of a lot of people. And when you're dealing with an asset this volatile, regardless of how high it was at the time, people were able to look at it and go like, if this can go wrong incredibly fast. And people who are not educated on technology in general, not to mention Bitcoin, like first you have to get educated on using your phone, because that is a very big component of interacting with the Chivo ecosystem. Like Bitcoin ATMs in general, like a lot of it has to do with the interaction between your phone and these ATMs. And again, this is a skill that can be taught. This is a skill that we can learn, but it's also, again, this law was announced in June, originating from a single region on the coast where a sort of circular economy was going on. In a little over 4 months, they were trying to roll out this thing that the plan was to get it nationwide.
Yeah, I mean, do you think that was even a remotely realistic goal?
No.
Not necessarily that date or by that date, but eventually getting it to be adopted nationwide.
Maybe. Again, over the course of years. But then again, it would be years. This would be a years-long process. Not even in the sense of just getting people educated, but installing the infrastructure. Because again, you need cell phones, you need data.
Yeah, when I was getting ready to record this episode, I started listening to some Crypto Bro podcasts about the Bitcoin law and the implementation of the Chivo wallet. Now, these were all recorded before a lot of these incidents we're talking about even happened. So this is coming from very optimistic sources who were looking forward to this innovation. Even some of them who actually went down to El Salvador themselves said that even in parts of like San Salvador, the capital, they don't have the internet infrastructure to implement this, let alone outside the city.
Like, again, this is like a years-long project. Like, for this, you need cell phone towers, you need cell phones, you need data plans, you need to install the ATMs themselves, which...
Yeah, and then from the security side of the house, just think about all the infrastructure you need to onboard sensitive data from the entire population of a country. Like, even if it's as small as El Salvador, that's 5.5 million people.
Yeah. So even in the lowballing estimates, like again, they said the numbers were like 4 million people got onboarded. And if that's true, that's impressive. But
allegedly,
the sheer amount of fraud that happened as well, I don't know. This initial part of the project feels so much like a startup, which is going to play into my final thoughts on the whole thing, but just a wild fucking ride that seems so incredibly half-ass planned, at least here.
Yeah, so as I understand going into it, about half the population didn't know about the app or like that it was supposed to be implemented. So how did they onboard 4 million people?
I should say it's actually 68% of people knew about the app. A little over half, but not nearly enough. And this is all from a scientific paper that was finally published in December 2023. 68% of the country know about Chivo, but maybe only a little over half of that percentage would actually download it.
Well, yeah, they got to earn people's trust. I mean, you got a country that's mostly unbanked, and I don't know, it's one thing to be like, oh, we made an app without even thinking about the support you need for the app, but there are reasons people in this country aren't banked, and it's not just all, if only they had an app. Most people in El Salvador do have cell phones. They might be older, some might be cheaper brands or whatever than what Americans like buying. They might be less impressive than the newest iPhone, but it is a country in the modern era. Like that wasn't the barrier to entry. People have reasons to not trust institutions in places like this.
Yeah. There's, again, the reasons that the paper itself cites is that they prefer to use cash and they mistrust Bitcoin. Again, you have the barrier of entry of infrastructure, but also the fact that at this point, Bitcoin's reputation as a volatile asset, I mean, it's just a new thing to a lot of these people. Because at this point, everyone thinks that Bitcoin is going to keep soaring up in price. But there's reasons to be mistrustful of it. And a lot of these people just preferred cash. By December, Athena is out of the project. It has to be said that they're still present in El Salvador. Their ATMs are going to play a large part in sort of the bookend of this. But they are out of the project. And Alpha Point is brought in. And in the aftermath, there's going to be this lawsuit that El Faro locates between them and a guy named Sean Overton.
Yeah, he came up earlier as a source for one of the things you mentioned. Can you just remind us who he is again?
So he is the CEO of a company called ROI Developers. At the time, they were doing the business as Acruvia.
Well, those are some optimistic names.
It's a company of like 2 people, but basically he builds up like groups of programmers, I mean. And for the most part, they're doing like work for businesses with like revenues of 5 to 25 million a year. I'm bringing that point up specifically because this is the company that's going to get brought in to fix the Chivo wallet.
So knowing nothing about them, and no offense to them, but it's like, so basically he brought in a tech scale up to try to unfuck a national financial system. He being Bukele in my construction here.
Yeah, because this is something he says himself in the lawsuit. Again, this all might be hearsay. It's coming from this guy. But the security incidents that he's about to describe show up in news articles before the lawsuit comes light. So again, the interpersonal stuff might be complete bullshit, but there's enough proof that we can correlate security incidents he describes with things that happened that other sources report, even like pro-crypto news sources. So he gets brought in through another company that's involved in this whole thing, and he's pitched a deal of a lifetime on September 9th of 2021. Again, this launched, just to be absolutely sure, September 7th. This man is being flown in country within a week of the Chivo wallet launching to fix everything as much as possible. And immediately, this is where we get the information that like the government was told that the KYC aspect of the wallet would likely crash. They were told this by one of the vendors involved. And he outright states that when the KYC crashed, the government just decided to do away with it entirely because they needed to onboard people.
That's insane. So they just completely did away with the customer verification process.
He gives a testimony. Like, this is his testimony. Again, I have to keep emphasizing, this might be all bullshit on this side. The security incidents can be correlated. But he's going like, yeah, my personal estimate is that like this resulted in 10 to 20% of the signups being fraudulent. And they were handing out $30 in Bitcoin for free with each sign up.
So conservatively, we're talking 500,000 fraudulently taken $30 portions of Bitcoin. And if you were to hold that until today, that'd be quite a bit of money. And again, being Bitcoin, it's super easy to exfiltrate it.
So that is just some of the statistics that he's giving off before he actually gets into the nitty-gritty of trying to fix everything. On the technical side of things, he claims there was no documentation on any of the programming of the wallet at all. Now, I am very tech illiterate. I am not good with computers. It is the scam side of things that generally interests me about this thing. And even I understand that, generally speaking, that is not a good sign. So before anything else, they're trying to figure out what the hell is the actual infrastructure of this wallet. And, well, do you want to get into the interpersonal shit first, or do you just want to get into like the data, the actual like security issues?
I mean, obviously the security issues are more what I'm focusing on, but the interpersonal stuff's going to build the context. So let it rip. So interpersonally, the Salvadoran government approaches Overton and tells them that if he wants to, they'll kick Athena out. Because as of right now, ROI, Sean Overton, they're sort of bundled in with Athena trying to fix this, but the El Salvadorian government wants them out of the picture. I'm assuming to punish them?
Because it was a complete shit show on launch.
I mean, fair.
And again, I have to say this. Athena seems like a competent company, and they licensed the wallet technology to the Salvadoran government.
Oh, so maybe more like a scapegoat situation.
They're heavily involved, but again, it looks like they just wanted a scapegoat, or it could be, but again, I don't want to land on one side either. There's a lot of more to this. This is only one man's perspective. They want Athena out. Like Lorenzo Ray comes into the picture saying that Athena Bitcoin did all the programming. So he's trying to put the blame on them. And now there's kind of like palace intrigue with Athena's CEO moving in to try to bring Sean Overton directly into the fold of the company. So they can't be kicked out. Like he's being, according to him, he's being like hounded aggressively by Athena's representatives. And his entire company be brought in, and he's sort of bribed with this offer of just kind of being brought along on the rest of Athena's projects, like a constant, steady work in comparison to the payday that the El Salvadoran government is offering him if he cuts Athena out of this. So he goes with Athena, eventually. To directly quote him, what this term sheet accomplished for Athena was that it severed the government's option to remove it from the project. And so the only way for Eric to protect that source of business, this is the Athena side of things, that's who Eric is. And so the only way for Eric to protect that source of business was to internalize the Acruvia development team within its company. And the very first day, the week contract with the QA consultants expired, all the developers that were working on the project no longer serviced QA consultants. They serviced Athena Bitcoin Inc. Now, would you like to guess at the timeline of when this palace intrigue kicked off? The important bit is this is within like weeks of the launch, like days. Like food hasn't completed digesting by the time knives start coming out in the background. I have to stress this. This is Overton's own version of this story. And it does seem like he didn't get butchered in court. It kind of ended in a settlement, although, according to him, Athena would go on to try to poach ROI's employees right from under them. And the employees proceeded to tell Overton about the attempted poaching because of how incredibly toxic Athena was as a work environment. So this is just the interpersonal shit. You have palace coups, you have companies trying to get other companies into their fold so they can't be kicked out of the project. You have this all going on, and at the same time, you also have a cascade of failures that he's going to describe from the first person. So, just going down the list, one of the corresponding articles I found referred to this as scalping. But basically, the way that Bitcoin's price was managed by the Chivo system was that it would check it about once a minute. Now, if you ever seen the live ticker of the prices, once a minute can have multiple price changes, like multiple price fluctuations. So what people figured out was that if they had this open on like two separate screens, they could buy it when it dropped incrementally in price and then sell it when it was higher priced on the Chivo wallet.
Yeah, this is exactly what was done in the early days of online stock trading before a bunch of regulations went in.
So like Overton specifically brings in an example where a guy started at 2,000 and made nearly $400,000. And again, these cascading failures, they mean that like El Salvador is largely footing the bill for a lot of this stuff as a result of it.
Yeah, so a country that kind of can't even afford it in the first place.
So then a developer error, like a guy doing all-night programming, accidentally made it so you could trade dollars for Bitcoin directly, as in $1 for a Bitcoin.
No.
And for reference, it is at well over $60,000.
Oh my God.
Now, because of the time frame that this was going on at, he says that maybe they only lost $250,000 as a result of this.
Oh, only $250,000.
Oh, yes, only. Yeah, and then there was another incident where suddenly people's balances were showing in the millions, and it had to be shut down to fix this all. And we haven't even gone into greater details about how shitty the KYC was. Like, we brought up the KYC crashing, but we didn't even bring in narrowing in on how bad it was.
You mean besides the fact that sometimes they chose to just not have it working, or
no?
The part where you could get around it for almost free with leaked data?
Yes.
Like, how many legitimate new customers were even using it at this point?
By October, this was a specific thing that you want to know about, but like October, like, people were reporting that their stuff had been stolen from them. Entirely unrelated from these technical glitches. Like, people were going like, yeah, my wallet's been stolen from me. And people are testing out the KYC and discovering how easy it is to break. One specific Salvadoran YouTuber who actually has like some fairly good videos on the operation of the wallet itself. Him and a guy in the US collaborated to show the remittances part. But he's going like, yeah, no, I had a photocopy of my grandmother's DUI. I took a picture of it. That worked. And then I used a picture I have of Sarah Connor on the wall, and that fooled the KYC.
No, fuck, like a picture from the Terminator.
And this is from a relatively pro-crypto source.
That's awesome.
But CoinDesk is reporting this. They're saying, like, yeah, we received video proof from this YouTuber that he was able to do this with a picture of Sarah Connor to fool the KYC. And you have that link to that thread where El Comisionario, the commissioner, was tallying up like all the incidents that were being reported over Twitter, and it was like $127,000 in like 80 different incidents. This is just, it's out of control. genuinely speaking, and this is within the first couple of months. Like, this is the initial rollout. So yeah, this is the first 90 days of development, right? At this point, NetKeys being brought in to handle the know your customer, they are associated with iFinex. And iFinex is heavily involved with the bond side of things. But again, they get brought in. They're decent enough company. Like, this is still better than nothing. But like April, this is the last incident that I'm really going to highlight, but April of 2022, the users discovered a glitch where they could move funds from the Chivo wallet to bank accounts without the app registering it.
Oh, cool. So it was just a free money app then.
So yeah. So this was dollars, right? This is dollars being sent to their own bank accounts, but they basically recreated the double spend issue. And again, this actually didn't have a lot to do with, from what I could see, it might not have involved the Bitcoin portion of it at all. It might have just been the dollar amounts. I need to make that clarification. This is just a broad generalization of what occurred. But they discovered that they were able to move money out of the Chivo wallet into their bank accounts without the app registering that it was gone. So if they had $100 and they just kept sending themselves $50, they were getting into the hundreds of thousands. And I'm going to call this as sort of the last big incident that is like incredibly dramatic. To make it clear, it wasn't that the Chivo wallet got better. It wasn't that it improved. I mean, it did slightly. But at the same time, it's at that point that everyone sort of realized that, oh, this is not worth using at all.
Yeah, could you say something about Mike Peterson saying it was unusable at this point?
That is from a podcast that was released in February of this year, February of 2024. He basically said they really made it unusable. Quote break, it almost feels like they're trying to destroy it. Because this is a portion where he's being asked about, hey, can you live on Bitcoin in El Salvador? And to be clear, he isn't still incredibly bullish on Bitcoin in El Salvador. He's very optimistic. He lays it out fairly good. Like, hey, yeah, you can do it. There's a lot of like caveats. He doesn't frame it as caveats. He goes like, yeah, you got to go to the big stores, but it's possible to live on Bitcoin. And then he goes like, yeah, but nobody's really using the Chivo ATMs. And I've had to take in a lot of people because of technical issues related to the Chivo wallet app as well as the ATMs. And like people are willing to take a haircut on the Athena ATMs of like 7% rather than use the Chivo wallets that have like a 0% cost to them. And again, I'm paraphrasing what he's saying, but he basically goes like, but they really made it unusable. It almost feels like they're trying to destroy it is a direct quote with maybe a little bit cut out of the middle. Like maybe he's more positive in other places, but in this particular podcast, when asked about living on Bitcoin in El Salvador, that is his main takeaway. Yeah, people are taking the haircut on the Athena ATMs instead with a 7% cut.
Yeah, I mean, that's not exactly a glimmering review. Rose, just one last kind of line of questioning I have for you before I let you go. So the incident happened on April 23rd. I wanted to know if you've seen any acknowledgement of the impact of these. Again, these are 4 huge data leaks relevant to Chivo Wallet, including the source code of it being released in its entirety, as well as the VPN credentials and PII on 5 million customers. Like, how's the space even reacting?
I haven't seen them really acknowledge it. I haven't really seen a lot of people in the crypto space acknowledge it outside of the initial, the Chivo Wallet source code got leaked.
Okay, yeah, and it started to pick up a lot more press attention in the region, and there were some newspapers that did reach out directly to Cyber Intelligentsia that got some interviews. But at least as of June, it just seems like it's been weird crickets or like little acknowledgement in the crypto space, at least as far as I can tell, despite this potentially being the biggest failed experiment in cryptocurrency history. I mean, not to diminish it, but it certainly seems like the biggest failed experiment in cryptocurrency history when we look at the impact on regular people's lives. Not trying to discount all the losses from the fallout of FTX and the other crypto exchanges or the layoffs for the big implosion of the metaverse stuff.
Yeah, they're sort of being quiet about it. I mean, to be perfectly honest, they just seem like very... How do I put this? You've had a lot of interactions with startups, right?
Yeah.
Where regardless of how horribly the project's going, you gotta commit to the bit. You don't acknowledge that the house is on fire, and hopefully eventually it'll stop being on fire. That seems to have been like his game plan in regards to Bitcoin.
He being Bukele.
Yes, Bukele himself, yes. And by by extension his administration.
Do you think any of these decisions, short-sighted otherwise, were based in Bukele's personal investment into Bitcoin?
Well into the crypto crash, he was tweeting out about how he was buying Bitcoin, buying the dip. He was holding, he was doing. In general, that seems to be the entire vibe of all of this entire endeavor. I can't speak to his personal corruption.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to put like words in your mouth.
And in terms of how it was implemented nationwide, it's not necessarily that I would call it a grift so much as a horrific gamble, like the sort of gamble you make when the bookie is knocking at your door. Because again, there is a mention of bonds that are coming due in 2023 and 2025. They are negotiating at the same time with IMF trying to get loans. And IMF is repeatedly going to tell them that having Bitcoin as legal tender is not a good idea. Again, 2021, Bitcoin is everywhere. Bitcoin is in the news. Everyone is buying into the dream of Bitcoin. And hearing interviews that Bukele give with like what Bitcoin did, they didn't foresee the crash. They either chose to ignore the warning signs, which again, the entire world did. I'm not going to pretend that that's a unique flaw that this administration had, but they didn't think a crash was coming. They didn't think that it was going to dip as low as it did. And I could see it very clearly the way that it was announced in Miami instead of to the people first. They were trying to get some of that Bitcoin money to flow into El Salvador. I mean, again, bills are coming due. They need a source of income, and at the time, this must have seemed like an incredible fountain of opportunity, especially with how bullish everybody was in. Like, there's going to be like comparisons to startups. There's going to be comparisons to companies, because that is what this feels like. They're trying to get the investor cash, as much capital as possible, and they're hoping for eventually the hockey stick to happen. Like, eventually enough money is going to flood in that this is going to be worthwhile, that this is going to be a success, and this is going to be like a fix for a lot of issues, because they're making gambles. Another thing was the fact that they were spending so much money on this project while there were so many other social programs that could have used that cash.
Oh yeah, and how they were going to make like a Bitcoin free trade zone city and all the infrastructure investment that was going to take. Yeah, I know you haven't dug much into Bitcoin City, but from what I understand, they were going to undergo this massive infrastructure project that was going to divert geothermal energy, originally planned to sustainably develop the country and power homes, again, in an impoverished country, for free. They're now planning to use it to mine Bitcoin and power a city that effectively won't produce tax revenue.
That I did hear about. I heard about how that Bitcoin City site was a reused site from something else, but that part I'd never heard about.
Okay, actually, let me be a little more accurate about that. Won't produce tax revenue outside of a 10% sales tax. So no income tax, no capital gains, no property tax, no payroll tax, no municipal taxes. I know here in Europe and in some other places, the municipal tax is put directly on renters, but it's usually put on property owners. Okay, I think it's time for the Bitcoin City digression, which is just another layer to the dystopian element of this whole thing.
So we were thinking of building Bitcoin City. Over there, there you have El Salvador. You have the geothermal plant. Here you have the power plant, and close to there you have the Golfo de Fonseca, the Fonsecan Gulf.
And if you don't remember, that was the voice of El Salvador's president Nayib Bukele. This is at Bitcoin Week 2022, officially announcing and revealing the broad strokes of the plan for Bitcoin City. It shows this futuristic city and all these cool maps and everything. The next voice you're going to hear is someone not mentioned in the interview, Samson Mao, the CEO of Jan3. Just sounds like another flim-flam man trying to sell another financial product, except that the product is supposed to be the futuristic hopes and dreams for a rising Latin American nation.
We're going to be issuing Bitcoin bonds. Do you guys like Bitcoin bonds? And these bonds are amazing. The first one is going to be a $1 billion bond. And what makes it a Bitcoin bond is because it's backed by Bitcoin. So half of the $1 billion will go into buying Bitcoin. So the president is going to market buy $500 million of Bitcoin.
That also. We're gonna buy $500 million in Bitcoin.
We'll see. The other half will go towards infrastructure, specifically building energy infrastructure and Bitcoin mining. So this is why it's going to be called the Volcano Bond. And this is going to be a series. So this first bond is called the EBB1, or El Salvador Bitcoin Bond 1. But there will be more.
All right, so for the rundown of Bitcoin City, this info I got here is from a combo of snippets from Finbold, Business of Business regarding the info of the financing of the project, and Diario El Salvador. These are generally considered favorable publications to Bitcoin and the Salvadoran government in the case of Diario. So the whole thing was announced by Bukele during the Latin American Bitcoin and Blockchain Conference in 2021. Bitcoin City was pitched as a futuristic smart city that would be powered entirely by geothermal energy from the Conchagua, again, pronunciation, volcano. The goal is to create a self-sustaining hub for Bitcoin mining, commerce, and tourism to basically solidify El Salvador as a global center for cryptocurrency enthusiasts and investors. I kind of picture it the way Dubai has changed the common perception of the UAE in the last few decades. Bitcoin City will allegedly offer a range of financial incentives, including zero income, property, and capital gains taxes. The only tax residents and businesses would pay is a 10% VAT or sales tax, half of which go towards funding the city's infrastructure. I just want to point out that there's a bunch of research that shows that this tax model disproportionately hits working and middle-class people. Economists broadly refer to it as regressive. Don't let the shiny veneer fool you. This is just the flat tax that's proposed by a number of conservative politicians in the US and Europe, typically at the behest of conservative think tanks. At the heart of the project are so-called volcano bonds that you just heard about from Samson Mao. To re-clarify, is a $1 billion bond issuance meant to fund both the construction of Bitcoin City and the purchase of additional Bitcoin itself. The bonds are designed to be sold through platforms like Bitfinex with an annual interest rate of 6.5%, paid out to investors for 10 years. So keep in mind, Rose just went on for the past hour-ish about how much debt the country is already dealing with, some of it better than others. And food for thought, let's keep in mind that many crypto exchanges have a pretty colorful history when dealing with US regulators. And more in my wheelhouse, just going to use Bitfinex as an example on how bad some of these are on security. Bitfinex itself already had a major theft of nearly 120,000 Bitcoins in 2016, which at the time of recording is valued at nearly 7 billion USD. The CTO of Bitfinex was attempting to address concerns this past April that more data might have been stolen by a ransomware group. I'm not going to name them, it's pretty cringe. And it also looks like that the leak was largely a bluff from the threat actor. But researchers found that the data dump by the attackers had 5,000 records that matched active Bitfinex users. Samson Mao and other architects behind the Bitcoin City project have argued that Bitcoin's projected growth will make these bonds highly profitable. But as mentioned again by Rose before, their projections were based on an assumption that one Bitcoin would be worth over $1 million US by the time the bonds matured. If Bitcoin's value does increase to that level, the government will sell portions of its holdings to pay off the nation's foreign debt and generate dividends for bondholders. Sounds a little bold if you ask me. I don't think I need to do another digression within this digression about how volatile Bitcoin is. If Bitcoin's price doesn't rise as forecasted, the consequences could be pretty dire, not only for bondholders, but for El Salvador's economy as a whole, which already established is under heavy scrutiny by global financial institutions, such as the IMF. I don't know if we want to frame this as an opportunity cost or whatever, but just think about the resources being funneled into Bitcoin City. With major social issues, including poverty, healthcare, and education, still plaguing much of the country, I think it's a titanic understatement that many Salvadorans question whether or not their government's focus on cryptocurrency is the best use of national resources. My personal take is it's an example of very misaligned priorities. Looking at the environment, although Bitcoin City is promoted as an environmentally friendly, geothermal-powered metropolis, Bitcoin mining is inherently energy intensive. I don't think there's a guarantee the project is going to be as green as it seems. Its volatility in price kind of goes hand in hand with the volatility of its operating costs as the project scales. Again, Bitcoin was an idea created to facilitate private transactions, not hold up national economies, no matter what the crypto optimists try to tell you. While geothermal energy does reduce the environmental impact compared to traditional mining methods, I don't think it's a huge leap to conclude that perhaps the energy could be better utilized for other, more pressing national needs. Where we're at right now, it's similar to the AI trend in the US, where you've got tech giants. I believe Microsoft is talking about trying to get the government to reopen some nuclear facilities to power their data centers. I wonder where that's going to go. The growing concerns about the transparency and social inequality. Many believe the project disproportionately benefits wealthy foreign investors and cryptocurrency elites. Public consultation has been limited, so people haven't really had a chance to voice much concern beyond just throwing some protests. And many Salvadorans feel left out of the decision-making process. I think it's obvious this is a project designed to benefit a wealthy elite the most, and again, channeling what we see in places like Dubai. Bitcoin City is undeniably ambitious, but it's also a risky and polarizing venture. Its success is contingent on unpredictable swings within a cryptocurrency. Are we willing to build a society on this? Another big elephant in the room, Bitcoin City sounds like it's basically just another free trade zone, or an FTZ with a fresh coat of paint. Bitcoin City is supposed to be a bold and innovative leap towards a digital future, but it has so many parallels with existing free trade zones around the world. Like many FTZs, Bitcoin City offers attractive tax incentives and regulatory freedoms designed to draw in foreign investors. However, the benefits often come with significant risks, usually to the people who live in the country that hosts them. History of FTZs, particularly in Southeast Asia and the Middle East, reveal that such zones can become hotbeds for financial crimes, including money laundering and tax evasion, due to the weak oversight and transparency. I'll highlight here that in Southeast Asia, the weak oversight of free trade zones found in Myanmar, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, and Cambodia have caused them to become major centers for cybercrime, multi-billion-dollar scam operations, human trafficking, and varying levels of control by Chinese crime syndicates. I've written about this in a few other places, both here and on the blog, and at my day job. And yeah, I'm not particularly confident that a Bitcoin city state built up to be the biggest market in the world for a favorite money laundering tool wouldn't fall quite quickly to organized crime, especially given El Salvador's history. Another thing, FTZs are frequently criticized for exacerbating social inequality. They don't offer the local population much, no matter what people want to say about job creation. They're usually vulnerable to labor exploitation and environmental degradation. Bitcoin City, from all I've seen, promises to follow in the same path, creating a bubble of economic activity that benefits a select few, while failing to address the broader needs of El Salvador's citizens. This is all assuming, of course, that Bitcoin City even gets built. As the summer of 2024, there's still some rumblings of investor interest. The price of Bitcoin has gone back up, and an investment, I believe, is getting locked in for the airport and shipping facilities. But 2 years later, the volcano bonds are nowhere to be found.
Again, he is young, he is very online, and he is bringing modernization to El Salvador, and he's doing it in the same way that startups do it. Move fast and break things, undeniably. And instead, you're bringing your entire nation alongside with you. I am somewhat negative on crypto the way it is, but there is a part of me that still believes in the dream of what it's promising. Because I understand, like, state subjugation is something that does happen around the world.
Oh yeah, I definitely see where you're going with this, and I think I'm on the same page. I just find it interesting that, especially in the case of El Salvador, a lot of the people that want this institutional crypto push seem to be fans, whether they realize it or not, of systems of state subjugation. That'll kind of be where this goes sort of after your interview ends.
Yeah. I mean, my complaints are too numerous to list. Like, energy expenditure, the fact that it's supposed to be decentralized, but at this point, there is so much centralization of power. In this specific context, in this context of El Salvador, I need to make it very clear, depending on how negative I might sound on this whole subject. Crypto itself is a very valuable asset. If you held on to your crypto during this entire winter, as Celsius fell, as FTX fell, as SBF got himself arrested, as Binance is getting kicked in, as Tether runs the gamut of stupidity, if you held on, again, you just made a tiny little profit again, because at this point, it is here to stay. But it is also now close to the mainstream economic situation. They have the ETFs going on at the same time. If you are a smart, crazy, or lucky investor, you are liable to make a profit. But that is not an ask I would make of an entire nation. That's the fundamental issue, more than anything else. You are making an ask of an entire nation to jump on board with you on this project. Even at the time, people could see how things could go haywire. And then they did, in a very massive way. This is a point that some of the sources made, where this probably would have been a lot worse if Bitcoin didn't crash. The fact that Bitcoin crash derailed so many of the plans that were being made.
For instance?
El Faro reported on them possibly making a stablecoin called Colon Dollars. Again, the bonds were continually delayed again and again and again, nearly 3 years after this was all announced as going on. You have rooters on the ground within 2 years going like, we are at the site of Bitcoin City and there's no sign of any forms of construction. They made a gamble, it went horribly wrong, and now they're barely recovering, but at the same time, it's like, it was a gamble they asked of their people, and their people emerged from this winter basically moving entirely away from it.
Yeah, I'm seeing in a lot of polls, even ones that are friendly to Bukele himself, like a lot of people will respond to these newspaper polls with a relatively favorable view of Bukele and the job he's doing. It's still coming out to about right now around 9% of people in El Salvador even bothering to try using Bitcoin.
Yeah.
At its height, it looks like it was about 20%, maybe a little more than that. So yeah, I don't know, like they're not fooling their own people. So it seems obvious to me who all this is actually for. But you still see this guy getting covered favorably in the news. You see Elon Musk sharing shit that he writes. Like it's brain breaking. But yeah, now since they've forced the whole population into the database, it's just this derelict, like dead mall of an app with everybody's personal information on it.
5 million out of 6 million people just got their data leaked.
All right, Rose, I feel like we're starting to just spin tire now. So I'll let you go. Do you have anything you would like to plug?
If I'm gonna shill stuff, Obscuro Latin America, probably the best source on the narco conflict. Rally Point with Auto Robbie, he has a episode with a 916er, dude from Sacramento. There is a memorial fund to Cooper Andrews. Yeah, the Cooper Andrews Memorial Fund. I didn't know him personally, but everyone I know who did know him speaks incredibly highly of him. The money going to the fund goes to good causes that he cared about. The Cooper Andrews Memorial Fund. I would happily show that. I guess you can find me on social media, but I don't use it for anything. If you find me online and try to pick a fight, I don't know.
Okay, let's try to recap what we covered so far. Really just kind of finishing up setting the stage. So El Salvador, to solve a number of its financial issues and attract more streams of foreign investment without going through more traditional financial entities, took a huge risk and made Bitcoin a legal tender. Since doing this, most of the country has still not gotten with the program, outside of some specific urban areas. And maybe it goes without saying, but it's also mostly used by a specific demographic of upper income young men. To improve implementation, the government then rolled out the Chivo Wallet application. Just a fun fact, a reminder that Chivo is a word for cool or rad or awesome. So you kind of get the idea what sort of branding they're going for. Again, it's a custodial crypto wallet managed by the government, and they signed up the entire population for it without their consent. So in just a span of a couple months, a new system was put in place that had everyone's identifiable information, down to their confidential ID numbers, photo IDs, passport copies, and other sensitive details. At launch, there was a 30 USD Bitcoin incentive to get everybody on the Chivo wallet when they started using their account. Many abandoned the app after claiming the $30 US bonus. And focusing on what happened next with technical failures and public distrust, it was allegedly put together with a blend of mixed legality and untested technologies that were slapped together quickly and could have led to massive fraud and a host of security issues, which it did. Critics, including various members of the press, and even at the time, medium popular journalists such as Mario Gomez had reported varying degrees of retaliation against them. Rose filled us in on both the failures of the launch and the amount of alleged corruption and fraud that went into the process. He mentioned that all this went in line with his idea of the Bukele administration running the country almost like a startup, with move fast and break things kind of being the North Star of their decision-making process. He closed with his own take, which I tend to agree with, backed by a stack of his own research and quotes from numerous experts, saying that this behavior seemed like the sort of gamble that someone would make with the bookie at their door. Coming off of the threats to various journalists and other corruption is the next place I want to go with this kind of final piece in the puzzle, which has resulted in the April incidents a la cyberintelligentsia. Bukele's leadership style and his decisions are highly controversial. Bucking resistance and coming down on journalists with mafia-style threats is kind of par the course for the Salvadoran government since he took charge. But I still want to leave this next part up in the air for you to be the judge, as it can't be understated. There is an argument that El Salvador desperately lacked stability in both economic and the legal realm. There's a reason Bukele is popular, even if it's not hard to condemn the actions that his administration has taken. So Alessia, you wrote in your article in El Cafe Geopolitico that, and I hope I'm not misunderstanding the Italian, that all this was going down is, quote, the Bukele government tightens its autocratic grip on the country.
I guess it was a combination of factors and this is how I saw it at the time, but also not just me. A lot of people, I think, shared similar opinions. It was just like a combination between, security policies, the need for security policies, the attitude of Bukele towards his opponents, both politically, but also just in civil society and journalists and just people that were not in line or did not agree with what he wanted to do. But also just a very clear erosion of some democratic checks and balances that El Salvador has gone through since Bukele took office.
What kind of checks and balances specifically?
I mean, the most glaring one is the term, in Salvadorian.
Oh, like term limits or consecutive terms?
Yes, in the Salvadorian constitution, being re-elected was just not a thing. Basically, his now re-election that happened this year, it should not have been able to happen, but it did because he managed to change the constitution's interpretation.
So just for a bit of clarity, what Alessia is referring to is that the Salvadoran Constitution has been understood since its current form was drafted in 1983 to only allow a presidential candidate a single 5-year term, specifically written to prevent authoritarian rule from taking over the country, which is pretty wise given a lot of what was happening in Central and South America during much of the 20th century. However, in 2021, judges that were appointed by allies of Bukele and his ruling New Ideas Party determined that this was not legal. Opponents challenged the ruling with a pretty explicit wording of an article in the Salvadoran Constitution that says, again originally in Spanish, the presidential term will be 5 years and will begin and end on June 1st, without the person who has held the presidency being able to continue their functions even one more day. Bukele's vice president tweeted out when his nomination became official that new ideas are invincible.
So that would be the most glaring one because, it's very clear, a couple of people in Central America or just in Latin America have done it before. Chavez, Ortega in Nicaragua, where, they had a strong constitution, but then through some loops managed to change that.
Yeah, so a strategy of using the court system to give unprecedented power to the executive branch. Definitely not something that Americans should be paying attention to.
In 2021, he won quite a majority in the assembly, and then it was able to change a few other things and basically approve or disapprove of the laws that he wanted or not.
I mean, did this earn them any sanctions or anything like that?
The U.S. has been quite vocal about democratic erosion in El Salvador, and they were quite against him also being re-elected, as it was obviously against the constitution originally. Yeah. I mean, there were a few officials that were sanctioned. There were allegations with the collusion of the gangs of, I think, 2 people from Bukele's administration. They did put sanctions on them. 2 things that El Salvador could be put in the spotlight with sanctions is obviously, again, democracy erosion, but also just human rights abuses. And that could kind of go in a similar fashion as it went in, for example, Ortega's Nicaragua.
What are the parallels you see between this and Nicaragua?
Well, Nicaragua had also quite a bit of a slow erosion of democracy. I don't know if I'm saying this term a lot, but I feel like it really kind of expresses the problem well, because it's not that from today the president wakes up and just cancels all parliament or Supreme Court and whatever, but it's slowly an erosion of the checks and balances that were supposed to be there to protect the democracy. And I feel like Nicaragua is a bit further down the path now. Ortega has been there, I think this is the 4th or 5th presidential mandate that he has. His wife is the prime minister, is the vice president. So he's the president, his wife is the vice president.
This is fine.
This is completely fine. And in 2018, there have been protests. So, and also that's why I feel like it's further along in the process, because at the moment, in El Salvador, there's also protests, but Bukele does enjoy quite some Popular support. I mean, he did win the elections, although, I mean, a lot of the people that do not support him are not in El Salvador anymore, so can't really vote. Same for Nicaragua, same thing. Like, political opponents have been harassed, and people had to escape the country. Journalists, the same thing. Anyway, in 2018 there were huge protests, and this is Nicaragua, and then the US kind of like doubled down on sanctions, and the president is sanctioned by the US government, and creates a bit of a
pattern. Yeah, I was going to ask if this is part of a pattern.
A couple of countries that are going into this direction, Venezuela being the first one, obviously starting with Chavez, now with Maduro. Chavez, same thing. They had a great constitution. He basically, one of the first things that he did also took away the maximum term limit. And then Ortega did the same, and then El Salvador, some people say it is on the same path of this, but then they create kind of like isolated countries, and this I'm talking really like in system of things, but countries isolated from the international world order, let's say, that then have to rely on other partners, supporters, other than sort of like the Western one, or IMF also would not really deal with them much.
So what I did find is, in response to actions undermining El Salvador's constitutional term limits, the U.S. did impose sanctions on several Salvadoran officials. In September 2021, the U.S. Department of State added the 5 newly appointed magistrates of El Salvador's constitutional chamber to its list of officials subject to visa restrictions. Weirdly, Bukele himself has not been directly sanctioned by the U.S. or any other countries for this. The sanctions were included in a 2021 package that also punished several Salvadoran officials for the gang collusion that Alessia was referring to. The following are some relevant excerpts from the U.S. Library of Congress's Congressional Research Service December 23, 2021 update on this particular packet of sanctions. In 2 sections of the report, labeled Democratic Backsliding and Removing Checks on Presidential Power, they wrote an assessment of Bukele and the direction the U.S. government at the time seemed to think he was taking El Salvador. Bukele is governed as a populist, using social media to communicate with his supporters, announce policies, purge officials, and attack opponents. Through 2020, Bukele battled with the legislature and the Supreme Court over funds for his security plan and his aggressive enforcement of a COVID-19 quarantine. In February 2020, Bukele ordered the military to surround the National Assembly to intimidate legislators into approving an anti-crime bill. He ignored the Supreme Court rulings to respect constitutional rights and legislative decisions. Although Bukele remained popular, critics warned about his authoritarian tendencies and possible ties to organized crime. In February 2021, New Ideas, his party, and his allies won a supermajority in the parliamentary elections. On May 1st, 2021, shortly after the new National Assembly took office, New Ideas deputies presented charges against and dismissed 5 magistrates from the Supreme Court's Constitutional Chamber for inhibiting the government's pandemic response. Legislators then dismissed the Attorney General for having ties to Arena. And I just want to break away for a second here. Arena, while they were in this situation going after Bukele, they aren't necessarily the good guys. I don't know how substantive these connections between these people are, but Arena is like a far-right movement that funded right-wing death squads in El Salvador during the Civil War. It's a whole other thing. It is completely out of my expertise, but basically, this attorney general was accused of having ties to, I suppose, what you could paint as Salvadoran Nazis. The attorney general had been investigating corruption in Bukele's cabinet and Bukele gang negotiations. Both moves were broadly viewed as unconstitutional. The legislature then enacted judicial reform that mandated retirement for all judges over the age of 60. In September, the new Constitutional Chamber magistrates ruled that Bukele could run for another term despite constitutional prohibitions on re-election. Bukele, the legislature, and the new attorney general, who reportedly worked for a U.S.-sanctioned subsidiary of Venezuela's state oil company, lining this up with the things Rose was talking about, have shut down investigations into corruption in the Bukele government while arresting government opponents on related charges. Bukele ended cooperation with the Organization of American States-supported Anti-Corruption Commission as well. The National Assembly passed a law granting immunity from prosecution to anyone involved in pandemic spending, while creating a commission to investigate corruption in past governments. The legislature also enacted a Bukele-backed initiative to adopt Bitcoin as a form of legal tender, which the IMF has warned would be vulnerable to money laundering. The currency's entry into force could endanger IMF approval of a roughly $1.4 billion loan for El Salvador. The Biden administration has made, their words, combating corruption a key part of its strategy to address the root causes of migration from Central America. In May 2021, the State Department declassified a report to Congress on corrupt Northern Triangle, a term referring to El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, officials that listed 5 current and former Salvadoran politicians. In July, the State Department released a list of officials subject to visa restrictions for corruption or undemocratic actions. It included 14 Salvadoran officials, including Bukele's cabinet chief, legal advisor, and labor minister. In September, the State Department added El Salvador's 5 new constitutional chamber magistrates to that sanctions list. And I know it's kind of easy to look at this as 2 people not from the country in question, but do you think it's all a power trip or a grift to ride Bitcoin into personal enrichment? I guess it's my general question of what the hell is going on in El Salvador? Like, I know he's really popular. Like, how did they vote for this?
I mean, for sure, there is always an element of that. I also thought it was, I mean, not me alone, but also just a very populist move, a political move, just to really, it really does all feel like a marketing campaign, especially at the time when it happened. But yes, I mean, I would imagine that also is, it would benefit in the end, in the very end, it would benefit only a few amount of people. However, I think it's also a bit of a bad strategy because, I don't know, drift something different than Bitcoin, maybe. I mean, Iran on the platform of security, mostly. And, you know, modernizing, bringing new ideas, literally, that's his party is called New Ideas, right? And is actually El Salvador first president from a non-establishment party. There were 2 parties before that kind of produced all the presidents, and then Bukele won the presidency in 2019. Bring fresh ideas, bring fresh things, and you wanted to be the cool new president, but also with a strong emphasis on security and the fact that indeed El Salvador has been struggling especially with homicide rates. It was one of the countries with the highest homicide rate in the world. When people live in that state of insecurity, many times hardline policies are welcomed because what else can you do? Especially that has quite a short-term impact.
Yeah, just lock up half the country.
Yes. So indeed, if you look at the homicide rates, again, this is publicly available data from the police, right? But that's what we have, so that's what we use for data. I think if you look at 2019 and if you look at last year, it's the one with the least amount of homicides per 100,000 citizens.
Well, yeah, you're saying in Central America, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, way less. In 2019, I think it was Venezuela, Jamaica, Honduras, Trinidad and Tobago, and then El Salvador. These were with the most. And in 2023, it was the last one. And those, I feel like it feeds into the narrative of the numbers. If you look at the numbers, whatever that may be, whatever we have, Bukele can say this was an improvement. People are killing them each other less.
Yeah, but how did he get there?
Exactly. I mean, just very hardline policies and arresting over 75,000 people in a span of a year and a half. I was reading today that I think 1% of the population is in jail of a population of 6.3 million people. And that, I mean, not only is a huge issue for overpopulation in the prisons, and then, with everything that comes with, and issues within the prisons, but also where is due process? How can you arrest so many people? Who are you arresting really? Are there people actually in the gangs? Or are there people that were at some point perhaps affiliated? It's just a lot of, I feel like with this policy, a lot of innocent people can just be caught up in it and end up in jail when they actually didn't do anything because there's no due process. People are just incarcerated, waiting for trial. Indefinitely.
Yeah, so they're in detention. They're not even prisoners yet.
No, exactly. Also, not access to lawyers. Not always they have access to lawyer, and also they can be detained also just on the basis of just suspicion. It's basically guilty until proven otherwise.
Yeah.
So it's really the reversal of what a good judicial system should do. Because this is also possible, I feel like, because like he put the state of exception or of state of emergency. But now this state of exception has lasted for like almost 2 years.
Wait, so speedy and fair trial has been suspended in a state of emergency for 2 years?
I think it's been 22 months that is in the state of emergency. But that was a couple of months ago. So now it might be actually 2 years.
Oh yeah, and then didn't as speaking of dominoes, in Ecuador do like kind of the same thing?
And actually very interesting because Ecuador is kind of like the president of Ecuador is saying that Bukele's model is the model to follow. So that's why also all these due process things that because of the state of emergency, authorities can sort of like detain more people without actually having that the burden of proof gets reduced. But again, state of emergencies or of exception should be of exception and not last 2 years. And this, if I remember correctly, he has always favored quite a hardline security measures. And there was at some point, that on the surface, and this is not just Bukele, to be honest. It's been the case before that on the surface, like the government policy is like we crack down on the gangs, and below the surface, they may look at negotiating a truce or talking with the gangs leaders, to see if they can actually reduce the homicides by reaching an agreement of some sort. And this is also something that the US had accused. But he's always been quite like a hard line. And then I think in 2022 there was there was a spike of homicides, something that like in a couple of days like 80 people were killed, and that's when the state of emergency came into place, which I understand, right?
Yeah.
I don't think that's like too out of the ordinary, but has never been lifted since. So.
Yeah, so it's interesting. This is something I remember El Faro, like the newspaper news site in El Salvador, talking about quite a bit. El Faro, you know them pretty well, right? So I crossed paths with them when I was researching the Pegasus spyware a couple episodes ago. And it seems that Bukele or somebody in his government might have directed that Pegasus actually be used on the entire newsroom. Like one way or another, every El Faro employee specifically in the newsroom in 2021, 2022 was found to have had it on their phone. According to the editor-in-chief, apparently this corresponded with a series of harassment from both politicians and members of organized crime, and he believed it was coordinated.
But again, it's I don't think it's like a new thing. Like, it's not unheard of that there is collaboration, let's say, between the government and powerful criminal organizations. Yeah, so I mean, the government obviously will always like deny it, but it's not. I wouldn't be surprised. But I mean, I can't say like for sure, right? I haven't. Yeah. I'm not there. I haven't.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, I remember this being a thing and El Faro being one at the forefront of, I came across them a lot in my research. I also I went to a presentation also of one of the editors of El Faro, and which was really, really interesting. But basically, yeah, that's also what he was saying, that and I think he lives now outside of El Salvador, and it's not safe for him to go back. I feel like, I don't know, like as every investigative outlet or news outlet, you will make enemies, right? And what you publish is uncomfortable for some people. But I do think that, I mean, the people that I've worked with in these few years always regarded El Faro as being a very, very good news source.
Yeah, my experience, the only people that I've heard anything about El Faro being unreliable are the Salvadoran police.
Yes, yeah. Most of the academics love El Faro. Yeah. People that I've worked with before, also journalists, considered it a reputable news source. So if they say something, it is very likely to have some, truth to it, basically.
So I think at this point it's kind of safe to call it out that Bukele has established a police state.
If what you care is security, full stop, he helped. But I feel like that also this, like in the end, will or even like it will benefit some people, right? Obviously, as always, but anybody who is just being wrongly imprisoned, and I'm sure there are many, well, their lives obviously are ruined. Their lives of their families are ruined. I find it quite interesting and fascinating, the interplay between security and democracy in this case, and what constitutes a democratic society.
Yeah, I mean, like, even the guy who allegedly committed the crime that prompted this whole podcast being recorded in the first place said that he does appreciate that, like, it is safer, but at what cost? One last thing I just wanted to mention before we finally finished establishing the foundation for all of this. According to a 2023 investigation by Human Rights Watch, and I know Amnesty International's report on this as well, of the over 70,000 arbitrary arrests that have taken place in the country, around 3,000 of them have been children, many of who have been pressured into providing false confessions. And at least according to a report that went out earlier this year, nearly 600 of them are serving sentences for these alleged crimes at the moment. So that doesn't even count the ones in detention. I just really didn't want that to go unsaid. So this is the final piece of the story about Chivo Wallet as far as what we'll cover on this series anyway. If anyone is wondering, yes, this part was rewritten and re-recorded in November. Why did I wait so long? I'll get more specific about the details in the newsletter that should be coming out in December. You can check that out in the episode links or find the Moloch on Steady, our newsletter provider. But at the end of the day, it ended up being for the best, as a lot has come out that wasn't in May when I initially started putting this together. And frankly, I don't think the story that I started to cover here is even close to the end. In fact, I think the episode would have been severely lacking if I had rushed it out in April or May. And in the weeks leading up to this recording, the threat actor renewed their campaign in ways that'll be made clear if you keep listening. Let's just say, for the completeness of the story, this was it was a good idea to wait. There are also a bunch of other reasons why the production on this one kind of became a nightmare, but it's water under my bridge anyway, because I'm a one-man show here. So why does that matter to this episode, and why would I say something like that? Well, this final episode is more or less what I originally wanted to cover when I was like, let's do something about the Chivo Wallet hacks, which is just the April cybersecurity incident involving the leaks surrounding the Chivo Wallet hacks by the threat actor known as Cyberintelligentsia SV. In this particular episode, I'm going to cover the actual incidents, the threat actor themselves, some context in their corner within Latin America's cyber criminal and hacktivist landscape, and explain some of their motives in their own words. While I went into writing this episode knowing far less than I do now about the subject matter, I learned pretty quickly that this would take a lot more understanding of the geopolitical context than I originally anticipated, hence the previous 3 episodes, 3 hours of this. So while I think of the 4 episodes, this is probably the one that it might be the most possible to enjoy as a standalone piece. I'd encourage you to listen to the first 3 in order to make up the gap in context, or so you could just understand why I treated this quite a bit differently than any other story I had wanted to cover here before. When I first started looking into Cyberintelligentsia SV, I'll be honest, I wasn't expecting much. You spent a lot of time following hacktivists. You know the type. There's some edgy Twitter account. They post a Guy Fawkes mask. They DDoS a website for 10 minutes, say they've stuck it to the imperialists or whatever. More often than not, it's a whole lot of noise without any clear point, or, there's Putin simps. But Cyberintelligentsia was, they're different. The more I dug in, the more surprised I became. It wasn't the work of some shit-posting opportunists looking for clout for the most part. Instead, I found a group or person who is deliberate and very aware of their public image. They've given interviews, they've released manifestos, and more importantly, they seem committed to an anti-corruption message. They've even provided for free a series of Telegram-based bot services for going through the documents that they've leaked, which some traditional outlets have even used to improve their own anti-corruption investigations. Despite the Bukele administration's flashy promises of modernization, its reckless approach to all of this technology, Bitcoin, Chivo Wallet, everything, has left the country really vulnerable. People's identities, their data, Their freedoms have been compromised. This is completely even outside of the mass incarceration and, sold out to a system that prioritizes their optics over national security and the investment mostly from foreigners over any sense of actual justice for their own people. Like, sure, they lowered the crime rates, but at the cost of incarcerating how many innocent people? And we'll get to it. Some of the documents that Cyberintelligentsia leaked did lead to other outlets being able to locate people who were disappeared by the government. To Cyberintelligentsia, the Bukele regime represents something very dark. And regarding Chivo Wallet specifically, in some of their earliest press appearances, the group actually refers to Chivo Wallet as a tool of not necessarily government surveillance, but a tool for centralizing power. Now, that's not to say, and I'll probably get into it a little bit later, that they didn't have some good things to say about some of the immediate effects of the things that Bukele had done, or at least those respective of like public safety and just being able to go out at night. So I don't want to paint them as like someone with absolutely no sense of nuance. But at the end of the day, they just seem very principled. And while their methods, hacking, leaking sensitive data, they're not something I'm eager to endorse, it's hard to ignore the effectiveness of the campaign so far. They've exposed a lot of systemic weaknesses that no one else seemed willing to talk about. They've shown breach by breach just how insecure the Salvadoran state had become. It wasn't just chaos for chaos's sake. It's also worth noting how cooperative they've been with the press. They've made appearances largely in Spanish media, but in a couple crypto and cybersecurity outlets, and released carefully worded statements that accompany their leaks. It's really rare to see a threat actor this intentional about shaping public perception. Most threat actors now will just throw data onto the internet and let chaos play out. Cyberintelligentsia has worked alongside journalists to tell a specific story, a story of the corruption at the heart of the Bukele administration's so-called progress. They're not beyond critique. They broke laws. They did potentially harm a lot of people, and they made choices I don't agree with, but the message and the way they've delivered it definitely deserves attention. They've shown the world that El Salvador's high-tech experiment is just that, an experiment, one that's failing the people it's supposed to be helping. There's also been some drama within or regarding and involving the group. They've claimed to be flushing out profiteers and more chaotic elements that attempted to make money from the stolen data. I'll try to get into that as best I can, but it may diverge a little too much from what I think is the very clear message that lies at the heart of their actions. Cyberintelligentsia SV has surprised me, not just for the scale of their campaign, but for how human their message feels. They're not trying to burn the system down for fun, they're showing us a mirror. And as I dig deeper into their work, I realize they might not be the villain of the story, or at least not the one that we should be worried about. So let's take a look at where the campaign began earlier this year. On April 2nd, Cyberintelligentsia carried out 2 significant data breaches, seeming to target both El Salvador's citizens and the country's core security institutions. The leaks didn't just expose vulnerabilities, they were meant to send a deliberate message about the state of cybersecurity, privacy, and governance under President Nayib Bukele. The first leak of the citizen data was a massive database containing the personal information of approximately 5.1 million Salvadorans. That's about 80% of the country's population. It wasn't just a list of names. They leaked data totaling 144 gigs, including high-def photos directly tied to individuals' DUI, or effectively their social security numbers, full names, date of births, phone numbers, and email addresses, residential addresses, and other identifiable information. The sheer comprehensiveness of the leak posed an enormous risk for identity theft, fraud, and cybercrime. For millions of Salvadorans, the dump essentially turned their private lives into public records. As far as I could tell, on the same day, Cyberintelligentsia escalated their campaign by releasing sensitive email archives from the country's security forces. It included 10 million emails from the National Police and 250,000 emails from the country's military. These emails are believed to contain operational details, internal communications, and possibly PII, personal information, of law enforcement and military personnel. It's no stretch to think that this would have jeopardized national security and risked exposing officers and their families. But something that was interesting was that parts of the data were tied to the earlier Huacamaya leaks, one of the largest data breaches in Latin American history. The original Huacamaya leaks occurred in September 2022. The breach targeted military police institutions across multiple Latin American countries, including El Salvador, Mexico, Peru, Colombia, and Chile. The leaks exposed millions of emails, estimated over 10 terabytes of data, and sensitive documents from all of these institutions. In El Salvador's case, the leaks revealed collaboration between the military and criminal organizations, surveillance of activists and journalists, and potential human rights violations. The data was primarily obtained through vulnerabilities in email servers and was later shared with journalists and activist organizations, leading to widespread media coverage and calls for accountability in the affected countries. We'll have to put a pin in this because it will be coming up later, but at least at first, when I originally heard about this, I was like, well, how is this different from any other breach where, the threat actor pads the numbers to make it look more significant than it is? But there was a lot more to the story than this. Cyber intelligentsia repurposed the existing information, amplifying the impact and renewing scrutiny in El Salvador's digital infrastructure. After all, how could the government do such a poor job protecting such sensitive data? And given the press environment in El Salvador that we discussed in the previous episodes, cyber intelligentsia was able to find a willing ear to get in front of the story. On both their digital channels and in the press, they were able to describe their actions as a deliberate attempt to highlight both authoritarian overreach and the government's failure to protect its citizens' most sensitive information. The leaks expose a deeply flawed system where the government's flashy tech initiatives like Chivo Wallet have been prioritized over basic cybersecurity protections, as well as to remind the public that the recent drop in gang violence might have come through less legitimate means. Despite the scale of the breaches, the Salvadoran government remained silent. Authorities had issued no public acknowledgement at the time, no guidance for affected citizens, and no clear steps to mitigate the risks. The absence of transparency only added weight to cyber intelligentsia's message. The government had failed its people, not just politically, but technologically, and they were only getting started. Following this initial publication, Distributed Denial of Secrets, an organization kind of similar to WikiLeaks that originally received the Guacamaya leaks data, removed public access to the information. Their stated reason was to protect sources and integrity of their work. However, it was confirmed that multiple users had already downloaded the data before it was taken down, and ensured its continued circulation online. I don't know all of the details, and I don't want to misrepresent either party's position in this, but it is my understanding that cyber intelligentsia originally wanted Distributed Denial of Secrets as their platform rather than breach forums. But I can understand why a website that's considered relatively legitimate as Distributed Denial of Secrets wouldn't want something with unfiltered, non-redacted data of innocent people on it. I do know Distributed Denial of Secrets has had some of its staff involved with illegal activity before, but I don't think the organization themselves have endorsed any criminal activity. I could be wrong. I don't know them too well, but I definitely wouldn't want them to carry that. I was under the impression, at least in the US, they're considered an above-board organization. I do know that a statement by the staff at Distributed Denial of Secrets eventually not endorsed what cyber intelligentsia did, but did kind of take the similar position of it still should be on the government to protect citizens' data adequately. So yeah, it just seems like a complicated relationship, or at least one with some nuances that have to be respected. 2 weeks later, after seeing no response from the government, cyber intelligentsia published another massive leak. This one from the Ministry of Education. The database included full names, dates of birth, department, educational institution, and enrollment status of nearly 4.5 million students, both active and inactive. The breach also exposed sensitive information to minors, raising serious concerns about privacy and the potential for misuse. Educational representatives urged the ministry to investigate the breach and enhance data security measures. But despite the severity of the incident, the Ministry of Education issued no public response and provided no guidance to those affected. The lack of official acknowledgement drew criticism from educators and cybersecurity experts. It's like it didn't matter to the government. Then, on April 23rd, cyber intelligentsia released parts of the Chivo Wallet source code, specifically targeting the software used in the ATMs. The group announced the leak on breach forums, stating, "This time, I bring you the code that is inside the Bitcoin Chivo Wallet ATMs in El Salvador. We publish everything for free for you." Alongside the source code, they disclosed VPN access information, potentially allowing unauthorized entities to exploit the wallet's infrastructure. The dissemination of Chivo Wallet's source code and VPN credentials could enable malicious actors to identify and exploit vulnerabilities within the system, compromise user funds, and enable persistent breaches. While Chivo isn't a particularly popular wallet software, crypto as an industry certainly doesn't need any more vectors for fraud. And once again, despite the severity of the breach, the Salvadoran government issued no official response or taken any action at the time to mitigate the damage. The day after, the group conducted an interview with the Sheeb Daily, a cryptocurrency and DeFi publication. And while I'm usually pretty iffy on where publications like this stand, as many of the loudest actors in the crypto space seem willing to back an authoritarian, provided they promise to make them rich, I actually found this interview interestingly lacking in pushback against cyberintelligentsia. It even hinted at and platformed some criticism of the crypto landscape in general in ways that surprised me. Its author, who identifies as Gushinkan Yona, also claims to hold no crypto assets in a disclosure statement at the end of the article. In the interview, they frame their actions as a form of protest against what they perceive as El Salvador's slide into authoritarianism. They deny being politically aligned or funded by any external actors, and they assert that their goal is to push back against totalitarian tendencies and protect democratic values. And a quote from the group, "Many believe that we are a political opposition, that a foreign government finances us, but no, we are simply people concerned because the country's headed toward a totalitarian state, and this is a form of protest." They criticize the state-controlled nature of Chivo Wallet and how it centralizes control over Bitcoin transactions, undermines user privacy, and blocks funds arbitrarily. They argue this is a misuse of Bitcoin's decentralized ethos and infringement on citizens' financial freedoms. What we are against is the use of the state wallet as an attempt to centralize Bitcoin, monitor, and analyze its users. Bitcoin was not designed for that. It goes over how they find the requirements to register for Chivo very invasive, which, I mean, fair point. The government wouldn't have all this data that could have been leaked if they didn't require a bunch of it in the first place to set up an account. As mentioned before, they do acknowledge some of the positive actions by the administration, but the group describes El Salvador in it as a suspicious democracy. And they talk about how short-term benefits may erode long-term democratic norms and protections, which, I mean, we're seeing right now. And at the end, the group also talks about how their goal is to expose vulnerabilities, promote data protection, and again, they try to frame it as a protest against technological overreach and government surveillance. A few days later, on April 29th, Cyberintelligentsia claimed responsibility for yet another incident, this time targeting the servers of El Salvador's Attorney General's office. This one was a little different because it involved an actual website disruption for several hours. They reportedly extracted about 40 gigs of data from the Attorney General's servers. Once again, they immediately leaked the data for free on breach forums, and the content seemed to have various files from the Attorney General. And besides the files, once again, they included the credentials that would allow more people to access the servers. And once again, no response from the government on this, despite this being the Attorney General's office. And an article about the incident by, again, sorry, Spanish speakers pronunciation here, La Prensa Grafica, they say that when they reached out to the government 3 times for comment, twice somebody immediately hung up the phone once they identified who they were and why they were calling, and then once nobody answered. This particular incident received criticism from none other than Mario Gomez. Gomez, who Cyberintelligentsia had expressed support for in the past, took a stance that I think I more or less align with given my limited details. So in an April 29th tweet, he kind of questions the group's motives. He talks about how the PGR also handles public defense, including critical services like enforcing child support systems and other things that directly benefit citizens. And I just wanted to say, before we move on to the string of leaks that happened in May, this is where things get extra dicey for me with Cyberintelligentsia. There might have actually been a little bit of a break in the group along the lines of how to be responsible with the leaks, which I think is, for a lot of us listening, probably our biggest direct criticism of them. There's certainly some differences in the way some of the leaks are presented if you look at the different posts they put up on breach forums and in their Telegram channels. Some of them, particularly the ones posted to targets outside of El Salvador, have a price on them, but then most of them are advertised for free. So it just seems like a weird kind of change in tone. And they're almost written in a way that it doesn't sound like the same person. Also notable, if you follow their Telegram and other posting history, you can see that there's been some kind of back and forth, as well as accusations of imitators on several Twitter profiles and other Telegram accounts. And I'm wondering if there had been some kind of purge recently that we'll get to in a bit, because there was a direct message put out near what'll be the end of this timeline by the group about a change in message and a change in tone. What you're going to see going into May is this is when the media appearances and the public statements really pick up, and there does seem to be a unified message, a consistent set of principles that I definitely disagree with, but there it is identifiable is when they had a lot of press reach out to them. So just bear that in mind. May was also a busy month for the group. They carried out at least 4 more breaches, 3 against major ICT sector entities in El Salvador, and 1 for a school of innovation and technology. The group also put out 2 public statements, one on the 10th of May and the other on the 11th. The first public statement involved the release of a report, perhaps by a whistleblower to cyber intelligentsia themselves, or perhaps it was a statement they got a hold of. In any case, it's in the aftermath of one of those aforementioned leaks. Again, they put it out on the 10th of May, and I wanted to read to you the best summary I could put together because it's actually kind of chilling. This allegedly leaked conversation is supposed to be about operations within the Secretariat of Innovation in El Salvador. All right, so first, a little background. The whistleblower alleges that the events began in response to the cyber attack on ESIT, a federally run tech and STEM school. Around 45 technical staff, managers, and coordinators were summoned to the Antiguo Cuscatlan office. They were told it was going to be a morning meeting. Staff were greeted by the Deputy Secretary of Innovation and his legal assistant. It sounded okay at first, but then the atmosphere shifted when police officers arrived. They confiscated all the employees' phones and computers, including their personal devices, and detained employees in the office garden. The employees were reportedly not informed whether they were under arrest, but they were prohibited from leaving the premises. Later, 7 individuals were taken away by the police in a minibus. Those who remained were split into groups, confined to offices, and forbidden from speaking to one another. Employees were kept overnight without proper communication with their families and subjected to interrogations in the early hours of the morning. Devices were forcibly unlocked, and the content was reviewed without oversight. On the second day, employees were transported to a forensics center for polygraph tests that resembled interrogations about their involvement in the ESIT breach and about specific colleagues. The report implicates Daniel Mendez, the Secretary of Innovation, as orchestrating this ordeal, with protection allegedly coming from Ibrahim Bukele, the president's brother. Fatima Rodriguez, a Ministry of Health contractor who also serves as Mendez's assistant, is accused of mistreating staff during the process. After the police were ordered to leave by a superior, employees confronted the remaining officials and were eventually released. They're given options for time off, with many choosing immediate leave. 14 employees were fired, reportedly for speaking out during the ordeal. 7 individuals remain unreachable, their phones confiscated, and they have been unable to communicate since the incident. If the claim could be believed, the crackdown was sparked by the ESIT leak. The leak post ends with a warning. A new accreditation system was being set up for the upcoming presidential inauguration. Applications would be reviewed by the presidential squad, granting selective access to media and personnel. If the story could be believed, it shows that the government did, in fact, take the threat that cyber intelligentsia presented seriously, but seemed far more interested in containing the story rather than reassuring the public. As I understand, ESIT is a specialized STEM school established by Bukele's government and tied to the Secretariat of Innovation. It's closely tied to the country's digital infrastructure, and its success is important to Bukele's public image. Having such a devastating breach would most certainly be an embarrassment. Maybe the story shows that things were starting to get personal. Maybe cyber intelligentsia hit Bukele somewhere where it hurt. All that said, while I find a lot of reporting, again all local, on suspicious activity related to the ESIT breach, I didn't see anything that corroborates so many people being fired or disappeared in the aftermath of it. Reporting from La Prensa Grafica showed that the school remained closed for nearly a month after the incident. For one reason or another, I like to think it's because it was obvious things were heating up because of the incident with ESIT. Cyber Intelligentsia released their official manifesto. Again, this is May 11th, 2024. Again, it was originally written in Spanish, but this is a translation. Motivations and other thoughts. We are not new to the world of hacks and leaks, but as a group of individuals from across Latin America, we decided to act together, focusing on El Salvador. We operate independently, funded by our own resources. We are not financed by any political party or third party, nor do we seek to profit or favor any political group. We do not take orders from anyone. We compromise organizations as we see fit, and we use our sources of information for the benefit of the common good, although not all our activities are made public for the safety of our members and sources. Anything you see on social media that does not originate from this channel, referring to their Telegram channel, or breach forums is false. Many people try to associate us with national political opposition groups, but let me emphasize, our motivations do not lie there. We seek to show people, in a raw and unfiltered way, the dangers of the modern digital society, how a handful of incompetent individuals control information and use it to manipulate the masses. Furthermore, we expose how all citizens are complicit in perpetuating a system of manipulation and control. We have expressed our discontent with the Salvadoran state increasingly centralizing its power over individuals and heading towards a totalitarian regime. We believe that information does not belong to the state. It belongs to everyone. That is why we aim to liberate information for all, so people can truly understand how the system works and defend themselves against potential abuses. This does not only pertain to state organizations, but also to companies that mishandle their clients' information. We are aware of the potential misuse of information. We're equally convinced that there is proportional potential for its good use. We're simply waiting for the right moment to release information that has been kept locked away by a select few. Information belongs to the people, and everyone has the right to know. We stand against those who restrict information that belongs to Salvadoran society. P.S. Part of my personal inspiration came from the work Lagora Leaks. And then at the end, there's a link to their interview with Sheeb Daily. Just a quick aside, Lagora Leaks refers to a breach in 2019 of the Argentinian police apparatus. A lot of the details of it align a lot with the work shown with the Guacamaya leaks. Then on the 20th of May, they did a brief interview with El Salvador Now. In this one, they repeated a bunch of the main points of their manifesto, but also said that they were preparing 2 major tranches of leaked data totaling over 9 terabytes. They also mentioned a data breach that I actually wasn't able to find, but I found a lot of talk about it, but I have not found any major announcements in mainstream media about it, claiming that they had over 500,000 credit profiles that they were releasing and that they had taken a bunch of data from Equifax. I'm not saying they're full of shit. I mean, far from it, to be honest. I think we've seen at this point that the Salvadoran government is willing to cover things of this nature up. And this is now 8 weeks into the direct threat Cyberintelligentsia has posed to them. And they do have all the data available. If you look hard enough, you can find the leaks. They give it all away. Well, they give it all away if you found it through their, I don't want to say legitimate, but through their primary channels. I just tend to not give my full trust in breach data if it's not verified by an external source. But I don't know, maybe it's naive of me, but I kind of had a tendency to maybe believe them, especially after what happened next. So I eventually got to talk to somebody representing the group. The conversation was brief, and understandably it felt a little guarded, and I just really wasn't sure what to expect. I was translating the responses, so I think there was a little connotation missed, but some of the details definitely seem like they're worth sharing. I don't want to retread too much territory. In it, they apologized for the late response, because it took a few weeks for them to get back to me, and they talked about how they were extremely busy analyzing data for the next leak and seeing if it was worth publishing. So, some things to highlight. I told them that the leaks were going to hurt regular people. While accepting my place as an outsider with nothing really on the line here, I still thought it was important to push on that. Like I said in the second episode, I was able to set up a Chivo Wallet account, and their breach data probably would have let me get full access with enough trial and error. Their response: activism is a protest in itself. You've seen everything people do when they protest. It's their right. Sometimes you have to make a hard decision to send a message. I told him about how the initial catalyst for the interview was the Chivo Wallet hack, before bringing me into what I later learned was going on with all the other leaks. I knew they had moved past Chivo, but I wanted to know their take on it. Any publications referencing our hack are just to wash their hands. I wasn't quite sure what he meant by that, but I wanted to make sure I included it. After years of activity, there are still people with blocked funds. There's been no response or solution. Chivo doesn't have any real offices where people can complain. The Customer Protection Office deliberately rejects petitions from those affected. Chivo was to be a tool of control and surveillance for Salvadorans. It was at this point that we talked about the mass incarceration and arrests of people in El Salvador. The speaker talked to me and showed me a specific document from the Guacamaya leaks and some of their work in April. Part of this included police communications and presentations that aligned with accusations that were corroborated in other Latin American publications. There's pretty incriminating evidence that suggested that the police were detaining people under extremely dubious circumstances. Some of these people were minors. Later in the conversation, they encouraged me to look for more evidence in the Guacamaya files related to the spying on and monitoring of dissidents. They also told me to look more closely at the ways Bukele was trying to hang on to power, the state of emergency, abuses of the Constitution, and the judiciary. We talked about the fact that neither of us could seem to figure out exactly where Bukele's Bitcoin and Bitcoin investment cash was coming from, and that this may be related to something that they were trying to investigate further. Their exact response was, "No one really knows. There's information being withheld." My last serious question for them was how they actually managed their breaches. The implication of their response was that it was almost all social engineering. As May turned to June, the administration began trying what every other authoritarian regime eventually tries in the face of such damning information coming to light. It tried to cut off the access to it. In early June, shortly after Nayib Bukele began his second presidential term, Salvadoran internet service providers deliberately restricted access to Telegram. This happened as citizens tried to access the leaked documents published by Cyberintelligentsia, specifically from the Supreme Court Justice and Tribunal Ethics Committee. Many reported being unable to open Telegram through mobile data or Wi-Fi, forcing them to rely on VPNs or proxies to access the platform. Several third-party monitors, including NetBlocks, identified multiple Salvadoran ISPs, including Movistar and Tigo, for blocking access to Telegram. Notably, these same companies had previously been targeted by Cyberintelligentsia SV's data breaches. Angelica Carmaco, the head of El Salvador's Media Association, publicly compared it to measures used in authoritarian regimes like Russia or China. Despite the restrictions, Cyberintelligentsia continued to release sensitive files throughout June. These included legal documents tied to the controversial death of a former security advisor while in custody, the secret release of an MS-13 gang leader, and documents about the use of Pegasus spyware, previously used to surveil journalists and human rights defenders, as we mentioned in previous episodes. The content warning here, to skip ahead 20 seconds, about child abuse. Later that month, the group published disturbing statistics from the National Civil Police, revealing 183 reported cases of rape and sexual assault between January 1st and March 15th, 2024. Most of these involve minors. Then in July, the group conducted another interview with Global Voices. There wasn't a whole lot of new things mentioned in this one, but something I found interesting is that in this interview, they said that they were affiliated or had a relationship with another threat actor called FocaLeaks. They're a group that started in 2021, and they became known for leaking at the time data on at least 37,000 national police officers. This included their ID numbers, names, telephones, office assignments, and email addresses. They're another one who states that they are trying to expose governmental shortcomings, but they also, especially in 2022, have been shown to be willing to sell data as well. So that interview was the last major update I heard from Cyberintelligentsia until very recently. And that last bit about the willingness to sell stolen data is actually something that is going to come up in this next part, where I'm basically trying to figure out who is Cyberintelligentsia. Not that I'm going to be able to point a finger at any specific person, but there's this stated mission that they have. There's an effect that they're having on the narrative of the Salvadoran state and its ability to project its authority in technological spaces. It is an effective hacktivism campaign. However, there does seem to be some back and forth, some sort of disconnect with some of the things that they say in these interviews, some of the way they generally present themselves, and some of the things that I've seen. But very recently, it looks like they've actually taken steps to address this. Or it's another impersonator claiming that they've taken steps to address this. It gets a little messy for me. It seems this fall wrapped up, there was more scrutiny brought to the group. A number of their channels had been taken down, and allegedly, an impersonator tried to take their page from them on Twitter. To be honest, in the hacktivist space, this is actually kind of normal. It seems the biggest tell to legitimacy for Cyberintelligentsia is that they have been maintaining their leak channel uninterrupted on Telegram since at least June. They've since released a series of Telegram bots designed to help viewers comb their data. While I understand this could be easily abused by bad actors, and frankly, I think this should have just been left in the hands of journalists, but there is a clear commitment to maintaining this data, it remaining free, and a need to keep adding to it and making it accessible that's consistent with everything I've seen so far. When going back to their channel, I saw that there was some sort of conflict that seemed to reach its peak in early October. There seemed to be some struggle for ownership of their Telegram channel. I backed off from wrapping up the series then, as it seemed like there was something that needed to play out. Then I found a post on October 14th, reading, "In the last few days, without activity, we were discussing with the admins about the changes and guidelines that will take place with the hacktivist movement, and something bigger than you can imagine has already been agreed upon. And later in the evening, we'll give you the official statement of the situation. Be careful, because corruption will always come to light. We are Cyberintelligentsia SV." Again, reminder, translation, not perfect. Then the statement later that night read, "Statement from the true hacktivist movement, Cyberintelligentsia SV. Dear citizens, today we address you with the transparency and commitment you deserve. As many of you know, we have taken control of this Telegram group after discovering that the previous administrators were irresponsibly and dangerously exposing the security of Salvadorans. What they did by disclosing your personal information, names, addresses, jobs, salaries, and even information about your families, is unforgivable. The information was used by criminals, both inside and outside the country, to scam and extort many Salvadorans. They integrated this information to a Telegram query bot, which you'll also take down, making it easy for these criminals to commit crimes against you and your families. Even worse, we discovered that the previous administrators sold the information of Salvadorans to organizations in Central and South America, further worsening the security situation in the country. Sold out to external interests, they abandoned any sense of ethics or social purpose. Additionally, we found they were financed by political parties. These parties paid them to use this platform for their own interests, manipulating information and publishing biased content. It is clear that the intention of the former administrators was never to fight against corruption, but to exploit the data to line their own pockets, regardless of the harm caused to innocent people. We are a new movement that has hacked our Telegram group, and we are here to do things the right way. Our mission is clear: expose corruption and exploit the systems of the regime that oppress the people without harming innocent individuals or endangering their security. We will not act against the population that has supported us. We'll always stand on the side of the truth. We invite all Salvadorans to reach out to us if they have been scammed or harmed by these individuals. If you have been victims of their actions or know any case of abuse, please let us know. We're here to serve you. It will make each of those responsible pay for their crimes. We'll not resist until each case is exposed and every scammer faces the consequences. Unlike the previous administrators, we are not in the service of the highest bidder. Our only commitment is to the people. We will continue exposing government corruption without compromising the privacy or security of Salvadorans. Thank you for your trust. We move forward with more strength than ever. In that time, the group has set up a much more legitimate-looking platform within a dark web forum for discussion, beyond just Telegram and Twitter. And I like what I hear here. However, I don't know if I trust it. It almost sounds too good to be true. On one hand, Cyberintelligentsia SV has been very direct in all their public statements about what they're about. But this statement, perhaps different in tone, does fall very much in line with it. But the criticisms made in it, if there was ever a time, these points about abuse of the data and irresponsibility could be applied, it would have been from the very start. It almost reads like a fundamental criticism of everything the group has been doing from square one. I guess I'm just not sure where the current leadership is at. Is it the original leadership? The post says it's a wholly new movement. I haven't seen nearly as much activity from them, especially on breach forums, since making this announcement. Maybe a very groundless but charitable reading is that the group kind of took the criticism that journalists, other experts, people like Mario Gomez have been placing on them and decided that they needed to save some face, and while they're still anonymous, make some attempt to distance themselves from everything that had happened before. However, if I needed any more evidence that the group was fractured in some way on messaging or follow-through, on November 23rd, shortly before recording this, there's a post on the old Cyberintelligentsia breach forums account. Their first one, as far as I could tell, in over 4 months, and they're selling medical records on it. This is actually like one of their most blatant attempts to make money off of something they leaked. And as far as I can tell, it's connected to the same Telegram account from the very beginning. There are some caveats in the sales pitch saying like they'll only sell to people they can verify or in El Salvador and stuff like that. Maybe there's something I'm missing here, but it's like bizarrely incongruous with everything that was written in that October manifesto. It does make me think that somebody here is an imposter. I just don't know who. I guess to figure out who's legitimate and who isn't, we got to look at the 3 platforms the group was most active on in April and May. The first one, the original Telegram group ID, is the one that posted the October manifesto. It seems to have new ownership and is saying all the cool things, but it's been on life support since that manifesto was posted. There's very little going on that channel. The statement was very much in line with stuff that Cyberintelligentsia has been saying to the press, but it tonally feels very different from the group I encountered in April and May, which, to be fair, it's not like they didn't say it was new management. Their most active channel, with its history before June purge for one reason or another, is still the one with the search bots and files that are actually downloadable. It seems to be maintaining the same pace and tone it always has, with leaks coming out relatively regularly, but none of them are going up on breach forums anymore. The group is also linked to the Twitter account and the dark web forum routinely, and I'd imagine this is the same group I actually engaged with back in April and May. In this one, They say that the Telegram channel with the October manifesto is not to be trusted. This group continues to try and run what appears to be a diligent customer service on their data leaks and search bots. But then, the wrench in the machine here is that somebody posted to the group's breach forums account with these medical records. Again, first time in 4 months, with that breach not being posted to either of the other channels. Its bio on breach forums links to the group with the October manifesto. So it's linking to the group that I find suspicious while also behaving the most incompatible with what was written in that manifesto. And I do want to also mention that that post on breach forums links to the ID of someone who at least shares a username with the original admin of the oldest cyber intelligentsia Telegram group. So either someone was exiled, someone is impersonating, or somebody took over an account. But in any case, there is something afoot here. Full disclosure, I plan on reaching back out to everybody that I can involved with this at some point early in the new year. Cyber intelligentsia stands as a prime example of what, in my mind, hacktivism can be, but also some of the most egregious examples of ethical dilemmas it inevitably raises. Their campaign against El Salvador's government has been both audacious and impactful, and exposed systemic failures in data security and reveals some of the authoritarian underpinnings of Nayib Bukele's administration. Yet, their actions are not without consequences. By targeting the Chivo wallet, government institutions, and other critical systems, the group has laid bare the vulnerabilities in the digital infrastructure of a nation, experimenting with high-tech solutions for its economic and social challenges. Their message is clear. The Bukele administration, despite its attempts to modernize, has built a system that prioritizes control, perception of success, and possibly the enrichment of its ruling class over its citizens' privacy and security. It is a damning indictment of a government selling itself as a pioneer of tech-driven progress. And let's be honest, cyber intelligentsia isn't alone in the fight. They're only one of the most famous and newest iterations of a broader wave of Latin American hacktivists like Guacamaya, Bukeleaks, and Goraleaks. All these groups have challenged state power and corporate exploitation. What sets cyber intelligentsia SV apart is their focus specifically on El Salvador's unique intersection of technology, governments, and financial experimentation, hacktivism as a form of resistance against unjust systems. Still, as with all hacktivist groups, while the intent may be to expose corruption and authoritarianism, their methods have put regular people at risk. I cannot say this enough. The exposure of personal data leaves millions of Salvadorans vulnerable to identity theft, fraud, exploitation, and all that, but also violence. Like, think about doxing, especially in a country that, until very recently, was dominated by gangs. In their pursuit of transparency, cyber intelligentsia has willingly risked endangering the very people they claim to defend. This is what makes them so compelling to me. They force a reckoning with the failings of a government and its tech-driven policies. On the flip side, it is one of the most obvious examples of the collateral damage activism can cause, and whether the ends truly justify the means. But also, to be honest, if it wasn't for them, there's a good chance I wouldn't have spent nearly as much time looking into the warnings El Salvador may hold for other democracies. I truly find what's going on in El Salvador to, in part at least, be a warning for other countries, especially the United States. As I wrap up the series, I'm left with a sense of caution and curiosity. I hope the story continues to force uncomfortable conversations. I'm not going to ask the dumb question oh, the hero or the villain. I think the important thing is that they made me pay attention. And, for me, the story isn't over. I plan on reaching out to these people again. As I grow in influence, I want to reach out to more of the journalists who have had to interact with cyber intelligentsia. And, I'm always going to remain critical of their methods. But I find myself drawn to the questions they raise about justice, transparency, and the cost of resistance in a world dominated by technocracy. To me, this is truly hacktivism. Hey, thanks for listening. If you want to check out more of the work I'm doing with this project, you can go to virtualveritypod.com or themoloch.com. This should take you to the same place. Find me on Twitter and Blue Sky at MarkJBruno and It's Bruno, respectively. The Moloch blog should also be on Mastodon on the InfoSec Exchange. You can shoot me an email at contact@themoloch.com. All writing, editing, planning, and production is done by myself, Mark Bruno. Artwork was provided by CM Kosemen. All music is provided by Chris Delano.
Greetings, citizens of the world.
This is Virtual Verity.
We are anonymous.
It has cameras and sensors.
It's a podcast.
But it turns out someone else may have been watching too.
And just like your phones and social media apps.
And although it was a piece of malicious ransomware on the surface, the attack wasn't really about money.
We are Legion. We do not forgive.